The woman stares in horror at her coworker's face as the features dribble and sluice off of what was once his head. He hasn't been injected with acid or doused with some anomalous solution. All he's done is open the office curtains and let the sun in. She, along with everyone else at the office, steps away from the ray of light consuming her coworker. He's melting like a lit candle on fast forward, his screams turning to bubbling gurgles. The woman can scarcely believe what she's seeing, but she has to. It's the only way she can survive. What happens next is a blur. The sun passes overhead as light expands across the office floor. Everyone caught in the beams starts to spasm, racked by some unknowable feeling. At first, they seem sweaty and moist like wet clay. Then, the dribbling starts. Ice cream skin cascading over wet clothes, burbling down to a sodden puddle. Everyone else panics, but the woman thinks fast. Perhaps acting on some animal instinct, she ducks behind an adjoining wall, out of the rapidly advancing natural light. She dodges it by a fraction of a second, as so many of her coworkers are instantaneously dissolved. 20 minutes ago, she was filling in spreadsheets and preparing the quarterly earnings report for the company meeting. Now, most of the people attending that meeting are, as far as she knows, dead. She'll soon find out that the truth is so much worse, but there'll be time for that later. Nobody moves for an hour. The dead remain inert blobs of gelatinous goo on the ground, and the living hide, some weeping, some catatonic. The woman, in survival mode, is drinking it all in, trying to piece together the details and find some narrative in all of this. It's the sun. It's something to do with the sun. Or is it some kind of airborne agent or AI-driven nanovirus? She just doesn't have enough information to go off of. Little does she know, this is just one domino falling in a catastrophe of global proportions. In the White House, the government is debating tax reform, balancing the budget, and considering whether the Pentagon vending machines should stock Coke, Pepsi, or both. The president is signing bills when the light shifting through the Oval Office window seems to change somehow. He doesn't even notice it's happening until he sees something strange dripping onto the paper of the latest bill. Something about funding for some new interstate transport project. What's dripping onto the paper is his face. Struck by an incredible tiredness, the president leans forward and washes over the desk. Someone in the Secret Service might have sounded the alarm if any of them were still solid enough to do so. The same happens to countless other world leaders at the same time. Canada, Australia, Mexico, the whole Northern Hemisphere gets it at once. It's happening in the streets and supermarkets at the same time, where the light is destroying, transforming. The linoleum and the concrete outside become stained by once human blobs in equal measure. One particularly striking image is a pair of boots with clothes crumpled around them. In front of the boots sits a baby's stroller, empty, save for the stains. The light takes all in equal measure. Hikers become flesh-colored splatters on distant walkways. Window washers on their adjustable platforms stain the very windows they were trying to clean, as the liquid that was once the people on the other side washes up against them. Every person waiting to cross the road at the street corner soon finds their way draining into the gutter. Every freelancer stepping outside their homes to take in a lungful of fresh air between shifts soon find themselves soaking into the grass. People liquefy at the Leaning Tower of Pisa, drip through the grates in the floor of the Eiffel Tower walkways. Tourists melt on the Great Wall of China, lose physical form on the cobblestones of Moscow's Red Square, staring at the pyramids of Giza, sitting outside of cafes in Poland, and exploring the waterways of the Amazon rainforest. In distant, war-torn countries, combatants wielding AK-47s and grenades freeze up as the change seizes them. The guns and bombs fall from their hands as their hands become little more than wet slime, along with the rest of them. Within moments, the battle has become eerily quiet. Wet army fatigues lay in the mud, soaked with the goo that had once been their wearers. The world has achieved peace once and for all, at the most terrible of costs. We return to the woman, crouching, terrified, ignorant to the magnitude of the horror that's just laid across the world. That's when the broadcast starts. Every screen in the office changes, displaying some unfamiliar logo. A voice comes over the speakers, calling himself the Administrator. He works for a group called the SCP Foundation, the one group capable of stopping this, or so they claimed. The so-called Administrator told the remaining members of the office who still had bodily integrity what they knew so far. Sunlight had somehow become dangerous. Being exposed to it caused an instant and irrevocable transformation. Those exposed should be considered lost. The Administrator recommends waiting until night and then traveling to one of the addresses they recommend, an SCP Foundation containment site. It doesn't feel real. None of this feels real. The message just keeps playing on repeat until it all just feels like white noise to the woman. She can't afford to think about what could be the apocalypse. She's not worried about the world. She's not worried about the office. She's not even worrying about herself. No, she's worrying about her wife. She's halfway across the country on a business trip, some stupid wilderness retreat, 2,000 miles away. Did the sun get her like it got everybody else? No, that can't be. Her wife is too smart for that. She's got to be. As the survivors in her office huddle in the dark, the woman pulls out her phone and frantically scrolls through her contacts. One tortuously long dial later, she's through, and the voice of her wife washes over her like liquid silk. She's never been more relieved. When the chaos unfolded, she was in a hot yoga sauna tent, safely out of the sun's new and deadly glare. Plenty of others on the trip hadn't been so lucky, but they couldn't afford to worry about it now. When the change happened, they all received texts from the same SCP Foundation that had been broadcasting over the computers. One goal was clear amongst it all. They needed to reunite at the last gasp of the world. Maybe everything would be okay if they could. But how? They couldn't drive. Even if they set off at night, the roads were gridlocked, full of cars where their drivers had cooked in their seats. They couldn't fly. As soon as the chaos started unfolding, planes started falling from the sky, destroying buildings and population centers below as their pilots took on a liquid state. Inevitably, the internet would go out without anyone to maintain it. So too would the power, critical infrastructure, the rule of law, everything. In the space of a few hours, the whole world felt like it was melting. Perhaps they could find their ways to the nearest SCP Foundation containment site, but then they'd be so separate. No, it was better to be in danger together than safe alone. The woman hardened her resolve. Somehow, she would get back to her beloved, or she would die trying. Or worse. Before she hangs up the phone, she says, "Stay safe. Please. We'll meet at our special place and everything will be okay again." Fast forward a week. She's trekking across an abandoned highway, weaving between abandoned cars. It's a cold, moonless night, the only kind that's even remotely safe. The woman has seen terrible and impossible things in these prior few days. In some cases, even moonlight could kill. She couldn't risk it. That explains her current outfit. She planned it extensively, a mix of items she already owned and other parts she'd looted from stores along the way. On the bottom layer, she wore a full-body wetsuit with Under Armour layers on top of that. She wore a long, black rain slicker with thick boots and gloves. Over her head, a balaclava and a pair of mirrored shades. By her calculation, not a single speck of light could reach her skin. That's all it would take to destroy it all, and she wasn't about to let her wife down like that. Not while she still drew breath. Every day, there were new broadcasts from the mysterious SCP Foundation, reaching every machine that was still able to receive them. Each one seemed to take on a greater tone of desperation than the previous, all imploring her and the other civilians to make their way to the nearest containment site. But lately, they'd been providing stranger suggestions too. In the previous broadcast, they'd even recommended, in the absence of viable food, that civilians eat parts of the blobs that were once their fellow human beings, as long as the pieces are small enough to avoid choking. The woman thinks that she'd rather starve than lower herself to that, but who knows what desperation would drive her to. She hikes ceaselessly, the contents of her rucksack shaking. It felt so heavy when she first set off, but as the days passed, she got used to it. It's mostly survival gear, spare clothes, emergency layers, a bedroll, a tent she could set up if there wasn't any natural cover when the sun came up. There's plenty of energy drinks in there too. It's the best way to help her remain in command of her circadian rhythm. The alternative is becoming like one of those poor souls in the cars. As much as her instincts around respect and human dignity want her to avert her eyes, she can't help but look in and see the bloodless carnage. Lone drivers, sometimes whole families, all reduced to inert, melted slop inside their vehicles. They probably all thought they were on a normal road trip, or thinking about what they'll have for dinner after their commute. She shakes her head in disgust and keeps moving. She won't turn out like them. She can't turn out like them. The woman keeps walking, focused only on putting in as many miles as she can before having to find a place inside to hide before daylight. It's funny. Once upon a time, she'd been so scared of the dark. Now, it's one of the only times she feels remotely safe. That is, until she hears something shifting behind her. Without thinking, she turns and sees dark shapes moving in the cars she just walked past. Were people sleeping in there? Animals, perhaps? No, the truth is far, far worse than that. The woman soon realizes that she's seeing the blobs themselves moving inside the cars. Wait, does this mean they aren't even dead? She watches, frozen in horror from the implications of everything she's seeing. The blobs rise up, smashing themselves up against the windows of their cars until the glass cracks and then gives way entirely. She sees the blobs slithering out of the cars and ambulating down onto the ground, leaving wet trails like giant, grotesque slugs. Then, they begin to talk. One of the blobs, the closest one to her, hisses and gurgles words that sound eerily like those of an innocent little boy with an edge of terrible madness as it begins wriggling slowly in her direction.
Hey, are you my mommy? Ha ha! Look, mommy's trying to run away from us. Doesn't she look so funny? You look sick, mommy. You look so pale. We need to help you get some sun, mommy.
The gelatinous creature lunges for the woman, several tendril-like pseudopods reaching out of its fleshy mass to embrace her. Her reflexes save her in the nick of time, but the beast doesn't let up after that. It keeps slithering, keeps grabbing. It's like something out of her worst nightmare. She drops her backpack to the ground, but it only weigh her down and get her killed, and runs for her life as the monsters chase her. For creatures without legs, they move with such nightmarish speed. All she can do is sprint until her lungs burn, until it feels like her muscles are pumping razor blades, but the alternative is more awful than she can even imagine. As she runs, more of the monsters in the cars wake up, the blobs that had once been the grand majority of the human race, and they wanted the remaining survivors to join them in their new, terrible fate. The woman manages to lose them, only just, but she hears their gibbering madness ring out into the night behind her.
We'll find you, mommy. We'll find you, and we'll help you see the light.
Dark months pass in a cold, cruel world. The woman can never stop moving. The second you stop moving, you die. Those things, the blobs, the formerly human monsters, were so much smarter than she'd first thought. They're single-minded creatures, living to hunt down unchanged humans and drag them into the light. At night, she sleeps in closets, a place where she thought she'd never return to. It's murder on her back, sleeping semi-upright, but those who sleep unsecured don't survive for long. She hears them screaming in the night sometimes, when the fleshy tendrils take hold of them and drag them out. Better them than her, she thinks. These months have made her crueler than she ever remembered being. Maybe that's what's required in the new world just to get by. She passes from town to town, city to city. The miles melt away beneath her booted feet. Her wife is out there somewhere. She'll do anything she can to get to her, no matter how many terrible horrors she sees. One night, she witnesses something so much worse than she'd ever seen before. She was sleeping on one of the upper floors of the high-rise when the ground beneath her started rumbling. She woke up immediately, terrified that, for some reason, the building itself was going to collapse around her. She ran out of the closet she was hiding in and looked out of the window onto the dark street below. An immense shape was moving, a giant blob, so big it would dwarf a city bus. Even in the dark, she can see the parts, the arms, the legs, the faces, both human and animal. It's an amalgamation, some twisted hybrid of hundreds, if not thousands, of those corrupted beings. They're joining together, she thinks, her brain injected with a sudden rush of pure horror. They're becoming super-organisms, and they're still hunting. They won't stop until they have everyone. Flash forward again. She's been traveling for so many months when she reaches the place where they agreed to meet. Her wife. She hadn't been replying to calls or texts, but perhaps that's because the whole networks are down. It's so hard to tell anymore. In most places, not even any electricity works. But that doesn't matter. She keeps walking. It's an old movie theater. They were here so many years ago, back when they first met and saw their first movie, The Handmaiden, directed by Park Chan-wook. So many happy memories. And wouldn't the darkness of the movie theater be the perfect place to avoid the sun? She creeps down the hall, looking for screen 3, the screen they'd agreed on, their special screen. The woman wears a mad grin of anticipation on her face, her sanity bearing the weight of all the terrible things she's seen. She opens the door and sees her, the thing that had once been her wife.
Honey, I'm so glad you're here,
she says, in a low, wet voice. SCP-001 is the ultimate nightmare situation, codenamed When Day Breaks, an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, irreparably altering the state of things and throwing not only the human race, but all of life on Earth into seemingly irreparable disarray. For unknown reasons, the sun became an anomalous force overnight. Its rays went from givers of life and warmth to agents of destruction. Any contact with the light, no matter how minor, and sometimes even reflected off of other figures like the moon, will cause those in contact to take on a gelatinous state. As I mentioned earlier, this doesn't just apply to human beings, or even other forms of anomalous life. For the most part, the effects of SCP-001 seem to cancel out any previous anomalous effects, as it reduces humans and anomalies alike to nightmarish blobs of unknowable flesh. But as you've already seen, it doesn't stop there. Not only are the bodies of these victims warped, the effect extends to their minds. While the Foundation was initially counting victims of the 001 phenomenon as dead, they were sadly very much alive, and they seek to induce their effects on others. The blobs hunt down unaffected people and try to drag them into the sunlight, at which point their secondary mission will become clear: total assimilation. Out in the scorched wasteland that was once the Earth you and I knew, these blobs seek each other and coagulate into larger beings, comprised of people and animals by the thousand in some cases. These titanic entities methodically move through the remaining shaded settlements, hoping to add more converts to their terrible biomass. While these creatures can be theoretically harmed, killing them has proved incredibly difficult. In many cases, just escaping them has proved to be a better use of resources. But they don't sleep. They never sleep. As the few remaining humans rest, they just keep hunting, as they will keep doing until the rest of humanity is just like them. There is no way of truly containing SCP-001 when day breaks, giving it the rare Apollyon class. When the chaos and horror first unfolded, billions were changed in an instant, forcing the SCP Foundation to go public if they were to have any help of saving the human race. In the early days of the horrors, the administrator of the SCP Foundation released a message to the world, the first time the organization had ever broken its veil of secrecy.
To those of you with families, or God forbid, children, I am deeply, deeply sorry. You must push on. Do not let their deaths be in vain. We do still have time. Humanity may still have a future. Come to Site 19. We need all the hands we can get. Learn to embrace the darkness, friends. Fear the light.
And fear the light they did. We all fear it now. Beacons were sent out to lead people to the secure containment facilities, but so few actually made it there. So many members of Foundation personnel died, or worse, were changed, as they tried to assist in rescue efforts. It was once said that Foundation operatives die in the dark so that the human race can live in the light. After the When Day Breaks scenario, it's the other way around. Foundation operatives die in the light so that the remaining sad vestiges of humanity can live in the dark. Whether that's a life worth living, dear viewer, is up to you. If you'll excuse me, I think I hear something slithering up against the door outside. The agent hides under the table as 3 nightmarish, warped legs stomp wetly past him. all belonging to the same creature. A creature that had once been a human being. Each step makes a moist, slapping sound on the tiled floor of the laboratory. The lights went out long ago, back when the facility was first compromised. His eyes have adjusted, though seeing some of those things make him wish they hadn't. He ponders how many of those monsters are wandering the hallways, lurking in dark rooms. But he can't think about that right now. All he can try to do is remember how many shots he fired earlier. Does his Sig Sauer sidearm still have 6 bullets in the magazine, or only 3? In a high-stakes situation like this, those numbers matter. As the monster passes out of his range of vision, still hunting, he sees a drooping, fleshy limb drag along the floor behind it. He counts himself lucky that the scar tissue has already grown over the creature's eyes. It can't seem to smell him either. This might be his chance to escape. With the practiced dexterity of his physical training, he slides out from underneath the table and assesses his environment. There's only one of those things in here. It's stomping across the other side of the room, mercifully cast in shadow. He doesn't want to count the limbs. He just wants to get out of here and complete the mission, collect his prize. But as he turns to creep out, another headache strikes him. It hits with such force that his jaw locks up, and it takes everything in him not to scream. Instead, he squeezes the grip of his Sig Sauer and prays for salvation. He needs to get out of here. He needs to survive. As though the universe is answering his prayer, the headache subsides as quickly as it came on. He breathes a silent sigh of relief and takes a step forward, onto a discarded glass test tube. Crunch. The creature jerks towards him, looking with what might have once been its face. He's been spotted. He knows it. All hell is about to break loose. To most, this mission would have been a nightmare, but if you can believe it, the agent had enthusiastically volunteered. This job will either destroy his life or save it. Flashback a month. It didn't begin in a compromised Foundation containment site. It didn't begin in the briefing room or the helicopter en route. It started in a doctor's office, where a promising young agent of the SCP Foundation receives an awful diagnosis: Stage 4 cancer, an inoperable brain tumor, indicated by headaches, disordered thought, and mild seizures. Even by their most optimistic estimations, he doesn't have north of a year to live. All the monsters and maniacs he's encountered in the field, and it's some faulty genetics that sentences him to death. What a sick joke. And the punchline? He's got a pregnant wife he's about to widow, and an unborn child who's going to grow up fatherless. They throw him a condolences party at Site 19. The site director comforts him with the fact that his hefty Foundation life insurance policy will still apply if he dies of natural causes, so his family will be taken care of. He's as grateful as he can be under the circumstances, but none of it dulls the low ache that stays with him every moment of every day. The inexorable fact: he's going to die, and there's nothing he can do about it. Or is there? A few weeks after his diagnosis, he's once again called into the office by his site director. They've got a special mission, one befitting of someone in his circumstances, a dedicated and loyal dead man walking. They've received intelligence from a Foundation research facility in the Nevada desert where things have gone foobar. A few days earlier, they intercepted a distress signal, something about an anomalous pathogen breaking loose during an experiment, but the person sending the signal didn't live long enough to specify what anomaly they were dealing with. Figures. But there had been no further contact from the site since the first transmission, so they had every reason to believe that the site was essentially lost. The agent asks his superior if it's an extraction mission. The site director solemnly shakes his head, commenting that anyone still left in that site is better off dead by now. No, this mission is of a different nature entirely. The agent needs to get in there, manually activate the site's emergency nuclear warhead, and escape the detonation zone before the site and the 15 square miles around it are reduced to irradiated rubble. This isn't a mission. It's a death wish. He's ready to reject it. His time is already short. He doesn't want to spend the remainder of it dying in a plague-ridden hellhole. But that's when the site director makes his offer. I'm willing to make a special exception here, Agent. Because of your condition and the highly sensitive nature of this assignment, I'm going to give you one-time access to a unique incentive structure. If you're able to complete this mission as directed, I'll give you a dose of SCP-001. That gets the agent's attention. SCP-001, also known as the Panacea, is a small pill bottle containing anomalous medicine capable of curing anything. Literally anything. From rabies to smallpox to the common cold to, well, an inoperable brain tumor. It's a simple decision now. The agent has to say yes. Flash forward to the belly of the RAH-66 Comanche stealth helicopter, where the agent is being given his loadout by the handler en route to the clandestine site. He's given a Sig Sauer P320 Nitron compact handgun with a few magazines worth of ammo, some light body armor, and a Dracaris Gen 12 12-gauge shotgun with Dragon's Breath incendiary rounds. The handler assures him that whatever is in there, it doesn't like fire. Though he should only engage in combat as an emergency measure. If he was exposed to the pathogen that ravaged the base, his superiors would consider him lost and send someone else to do the job. Comforting to know, the agent thinks. It takes them a couple hours to reach the site. It's cordoned off by electric fences, looking to the untrained eye like an abandoned chemical plant. Neither he nor anybody else could even guess at the horrors waiting for him inside. Not long after, he rappels down from the helicopter onto the roof of the facility and finds an appropriate entry point, a ceiling hatch he's able to pry open with a utility knife. There's only darkness below. He is glad that they also gave him a small flashlight as he carefully lowers himself down into the hall. There's no turning back here. Either he'll earn back his life or lose it. The agent is methodical, gripping tight his Dracaris and maintaining situational awareness as he works deeper into the building. He studied the schematics given to him by the site director. He knows the layout about as well as his own childhood home. The manual activation panel for the on-site nuclear warhead was in the basement, so he'd need to work his way down. Things seemed normal enough at first, aside from the pervasive air of tension, the fear that there might be some horror lurking around every corner. He's sweating now, but not just because he's worried. It's baking hot in there, like someone had cranked the thermostat up to maximum. There was no power for the lights, but they were still blasting the heater? As he gets deeper into the building, he notices that the very structure of the facility is changing. The walls of some rooms have a strange, fleshy texture. Vein-like structures slither across the ceilings. Desks, lamps, and computers are covered in red raw pustules. It looks like the very rooms around him are afflicted with a malignant cancer. He imagines that the inside of his brain doesn't look much different. Does whatever pathogen they unleashed in here even affect the building? This must be why they want to blow the whole place sky high. His musing is interrupted by a pained whimper down one of the darkened hallways. He instinctually raises his flashlight and sees a limping human figure advancing down the hall towards him.
Help me, please.
He looks sicker than any man the agent has ever seen. He's dressed in the familiar lab coat of a Foundation researcher, but his face and hands have been struck down by the most revolting rashes the agent has ever seen. His skin looks like a giant, livid scab with pinprick orifices for his eyes and mouth. He's wheezing. The agent imagines the inside of his lungs look even worse.
Please, you've got to get me out of here.
Without warning, the infected man lunges forward, trying to close the distance between himself and the agent. He's fast, but the agent is faster. He raises his Dracaris and unleashes a Dragon's Breath round into the sick man's chest, igniting him. He drops to the ground, screaming and spasming, but without a moment's hesitation, the agent fires off another round into his head. The infected researcher dies, but that's when the real screaming starts. Alerted by the sound of the shotgun blasts, heavy footsteps erupt all around the facility, fleshy and irregular, visceral. They're all zeroing in on the agent's location, and he needs to move fast if he wants any hope of getting out of here alive and getting his cure. He finds the nearest stairwell, kicks open the door, and starts descending, jumping 3 steps at a time. There's a cacophony of awful sounds from the flights above him, but he can't stop and think about that. There is only the mission. But the inhabitants of the site have other ideas. An awful red shape bursts out of a doorway on the flight below him, freezing the agent in place with sheer horror. It looks like the vague memory of a person fused with the dumpster behind a butcher's shop. So many limbs, arms, legs, tentacles, claws, faces. A fever dream incarnate. Of course, the agent wastes no time in giving it hell. He raises his Dracaris and unleashes several Dragon's Breath blasts, lighting up the stairwell in brilliant magnesium flashes and causing the monster to scream in horror. But this thing isn't like the researcher. It has the power to fight back. A flaming tendril shoots forward and wraps around the shotgun, dragging the weapon out of the agent's hand before he can react. In the moment of clarity brought on by the shock, he hears that the monsters behind him have caught up. A legion of horribles, things that had once been human in various stages of horrid mutation. Red guts and dripping pus abound. He pulls the Sig Sauer from his holster and opens fire into the crowd, hoping to buy himself some time. There's a fire exit next to him, and he had something far worse than fire hot on his heels. The agent bursts through the door and runs as fast as he possibly can, with the victims of the anomalous pathogen trailing quickly behind him. They don't seem smart, but there's enough of them that their intelligence doesn't matter. He doesn't have the ammo to kill them all, no matter how you slice it. He needs to lose them, then get to the nuke. He finds his way into a lab to wait out the chase. We find ourselves coming full circle, back to the start of our tale. The agent, in his attempt to escape, has stepped on a test tube and alerted one of his mutant pursuers to his presence. And in case you were wondering, he did only have 3 bullets left in the Sig. The monster lets out an ear-piercing shriek that's sure to alert all the others and makes a sudden dash towards the agent. He unloads the remaining few rounds into the monster's center mass and sprints towards the door, pulling on the fire alarm on the way out. In that instant, the alarm starts blaring all across the building, sending another spike of pain through his tumor-infested head. But at least it'll make it harder for the blind among the monsters to detect him by sound. Short-term pain for long-term gain. He busts a nearby glass box with his elbow and yanks out the fire axe within. It's his only line of defense now. Remembering the schematics in his mind, he runs for his life, using the axe to ward off the shrieking, once-human beasts as best he can. Floor by floor, he descends towards the basement, never fully losing the pursuers. He runs through hall after hall, door after door, until he reaches the secure bulkhead for the basement control room and punches in the code. Soon, he's standing before a vast control panel and remembers exactly the sequence he needs to activate the on-site nuclear warhead. The agent puts in the code exactly as he was told, and as he does so, he becomes absently aware of a strange itching sensation on his arm. He turns and sees with horror that one of the creatures had clawed through his suit, leaving a red rash against his skin. He'd been infected. But that didn't matter. If he could activate the nuke and head back, the SCP-001 pill would cure his brain tumor and this mysterious pathogen. All he needed to do was complete his mission. Then he'd... With the push of a button, the lights across the facility switch on and start flashing red. A voice over the intercom crows that the on-site nuclear warhead has been activated and that the entire facility would be entering lockdown in the lead up to the explosion. Lockdown! And that's when it hits him. He was never meant to come home. He'd been given a false promise and sent on a mission with no hope. He'd just be one more person counted among the sick and the dead when the bomb went off. It was so beautifully cruel, he can't help but laugh to himself. He figures when push comes to shove, there's only ever one cure for a disease like this. Boom. The human body can be a terrifying concept. You don't know if the thing that will one day kill you is already lurking deep within your flesh, whether it's a misfolded protein in your brain that will one day become a deadly prion disease, the clogged blood vessel that might someday make itself known as a heart attack or brain aneurysm, or perhaps the tiny error in cell division that could manifest as any number of cancers. But compared to SCP-610, codenamed the Flesh That Hates, these are all about as severe as a case of chickenpox. SCP-610 is one of the most virulent and deadly anomalous pathogens the SCP Foundation has ever encountered, capable of causing extreme and dangerous physiological changes to its victims. These effects begin with rashes, itching, lesions, and increased sensitivity of the skin, slowly but surely increasing in severity hour by hour as the disease progresses. Within 3 hours of initial infection, blemishes resembling scar tissue will appear across the chests, backs, and torsos of the victims, expanding to their limbs and extremities over the next hour or so. No victim of SCP-001 has ever survived beyond 5 hours. In high-temperature environments, the infection rate is even faster, with the shortest time to date from infection to full conversion being only a handful of minutes. Once full infection is attained, all vital signs will cease for 3 minutes. At this point, the body's advanced scar tissue will take on a life of its own, with vital signs being reported at 3 to 4 times the rate of non-anomalous humans. But they won't appear human for long after that. The mutations continue to advance, becoming considerably more severe. Fleshy limbs will extend, multiply, and split. Their body may warp. Their head may shift or elongate. In some extreme cases, infectees have become static and started to grow out into their environment, covering the surrounding area in tumorous masses, making it more hospitable for fellow victims of the flesh that hates. Highly risky Foundation observation has shown us that the disease seems perfectly designed to propagate itself. In the early stages, when the original infected human is still alive, it will seek out aid from others, hoping for a reprieve from its condition, increasing infection risk. In later stages, the creatures that were once human will aggressively pursue any uninfected people who enter their sensory range. Skin-to-skin contact is the most common vector of infection, but infection via the respiratory system is even more rapid and dangerous. The anomaly is believed to be connected to one of the more dangerous groups of interest the SCP Foundation are aware of, an ancient fringe religious organization known as the Sarkissists. These loosely affiliated cults worship flesh, disease, and corruption in all its forms, and some of the nastier anomalies related to so-called body horror and disease can be attributed to their rituals. However, given their inclinations, it's highly unlikely that even if a connection could be proven, a Sarkissist would give up any information that might lead to the SCP Foundation synthesizing some kind of treatment or cure for SCP-001, even if the Foundation resorted to torture. In fact, knowing the Sarkissists' unconventional views on pain and suffering, they might even enjoy it. Initial reports of the flesh that hates were not actually produced by the SCP Foundation, but the Russian government. After reports of an unusual number of disappearances in the area around Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. It's a rural area, and multiple alarm bells went off when the farmers were sending in reports of neighboring farms being abandoned, their inhabitants unaccounted for. Local police were dispatched to look into the matter. They never came back. Regional police were sent out to locate the missing local police. They disappeared too. When members of the Federal Security Service were sent in, and they failed to report back, it became clear that something out of the ordinary was going on. The Foundation were quick to cordon off the affected areas, where people infected by SCP-001 had converged into pseudo-communities. Remote robots and drones are permitted to enter these areas for observation, but aren't permitted to leave, to reduce the risk of the infection spreading. Due to both the highly contagious nature of the virus and the highly aggressive behavior of those infected, this anomaly has been given the Keter class, and a severe containment mandate to match. Because of the size of the affected areas, isolation and quarantine have been deemed the most viable containment options. If any infected creatures make their way towards the perimeter of the quarantine zone, the accepted procedure is to pepper them with small arms fire until immobile, before destroying the body with incendiary weapons or long-range explosive munitions. Even getting close to the creatures is considered too great a risk to be acceptable. Anyone infected is to be considered lost. They'll be euthanized and incinerated. Anyone within a 3-meter range of one of the infected needs to be quarantined for several hours to ensure that they haven't become a vector. Scorched Earth policies are the standard operating procedure for SCP-001. You may think that this is cruel on the Foundation's part, but it's a policy you'll agree with when you consider that the alternative is hearing a fleshy tendril slithering against your window tonight. If ever SCP-001 breached containment and reached a densely populated area, it wouldn't be long before human beings ceased to be the dominant force on this planet. As I said earlier, the human body can be a terrifying thing, and anomalies like SCP-001 can exploit this primal terror of the self, this bestial burden we all share, because it reminds us of the most frightening and universal fact about our bodies. They won't always be ours. A pair of SCP Foundation researchers open the door of a containment cell and find themselves staring at something unlike anything they've ever seen before. Sitting in the middle of the room is a giant lump that appears to be made of what can only be described as flesh. The two look at each other in disbelief. Just what is this thing? They circle the huge blob, looking it over, wondering what on earth it could be. One of the researchers finally gets the courage to actually feel it. He finds that it's warm to the touch. And does he detect some slight movement? He slowly moves to place his ear against it to listen, but a sudden shudder from the mass sends him jumping back in fright. Just then, the other researcher calls to him from the other side of the sphere. It sounds like he has found something. As he approaches, he too sees what caused his partner to call out. There, in the middle of this tumorous ball, is a door. It's a circular iron hatch, the kind sealed by a valve, and it's open. Now the researchers are really confused. A massive lump of living flesh is strange enough, but why does it have a door? One of the researchers peeks inside. Is that a couch they see? And a table? Does someone live in this thing? Things are getting beyond strange. The two researchers look up at the observation window where their supervisor is watching them. The supervisor does not hesitate. He nods at them, and the researchers know what they must do. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot. The researcher who lost winces. He knew that coming to work at the SCP Foundation meant that he would be dealing with some strange, dangerous, and disgusting anomalies, but he never imagined he would have to climb inside a giant orb of meat. His partner opens the hatch all the way and offers a hand to help him. Knowing he has no other option, the researcher steps inside. Inside, the air is hot, thick, and moist, like a cramped gym that's had too many bodies exerting themselves on a warm, humid day. He walks through the short entranceway, and his eyes adjust to the dim light to find that he's standing in the middle of a cozy little room. A single, small lamp on a table is giving off just enough light for him to see that the room is sparsely furnished, with a few pieces including a small couch and a twin bed. Outside, his partner calls to him, asking what he can see. As the researcher turns to answer, the door snaps shut. The valve spins on its own, locking itself tight. Try as he might, the researcher can't get it to budge. He bangs on the door and yells, "Is he all right in there? Is everything okay?" His only response is a muffled scream from inside the ball of flesh. He keeps pulling at the door, twisting the valve with all of his strength, but it won't move. The sounds of gurgles and wet sloshing come from inside the meaty growth. An alarm starts to sound as he strains against the door, exerting himself so hard that he feels like a vein in his head might burst. Suddenly, the valve loosens, and the sudden lack of resistance causes him to fall to the floor. The valve spins on its own, and the door swings open once again. The ball of flesh is quiet once more. The researcher picks himself up off the ground and slowly, carefully, peeks inside. "Hello? Are you okay? Is anyone in there?" There's no response. That is, until a blast of hot air comes rushing out of the hatch, blowing the researcher's hair back. When it's over, he peeks inside again. His fellow researcher is nowhere to be seen. Inside is the same couch, bed, and table with a small lamp. But there's something new there, too. Across from the couch, where there was nothing before, is a small television. While this may seem strange, it's just another day at the SCP Foundation, where anomalous objects and creatures are studied and contained, including SCP-002, also known as the Living Room. SCP-002 is the designation given to a large, tumorous, fleshy growth. It's roughly spherical, with a circumference just over 15 meters, giving it an estimated volume of around 60 meters cubed. Located on one side is an iron valve hatch, similar to what might be found on an old submarine, which leads into the interior of the ball. Those who step inside are surprised to discover a small room that resembles a low-rent studio apartment, complete with furniture and even a small window. Strangely, the outside of the ball of flesh shows no windows, and indeed no openings at all, save for the iron hatch. The furniture in the room displays no anomalous properties, though examination has revealed that the furniture appears to be constructed of sculpted bone, woven hair, and other biological substances, all coming from human bodies. Analysis of samples taken from the furniture has shown each to be constructed from independent and fragmented DNA sequences, several of which correspond to SCP research personnel who have been lost inside of SCP-002. To date, the living room has been responsible for 7 members of staff going missing. At the same time, during the course of its containment at the SCP Foundation, the room appears to have added multiple additional furnishings, including 2 lamps, a throw rug, a television, a radio, a beanbag chair, 3 books in an unknown language, 4 children's toys, and a small potted plant. Tests have been performed using a variety of non-human entities in order to see if they would provoke a similar response from SCP-002 to that of humans. Various lab animals, including those with close DNA to humans such as chimpanzees, have been placed in the room, but so far, all have failed to make the living room react. Human cadavers were also tested, but they too did not produce any effect. It is unknown what causes SCP-002 to engage in its behavior, but whatever process it uses to convert organic matter into furnishings seems to only be triggered by the presence of living human beings. SCP-002 was discovered in northern Portugal, following reports of an object falling from Earth's orbit. There, in the bottom of a small crater, was SCP-002. It was encased in a thick shell of rock, but the anomaly's fleshy exterior could be seen through cracks that were likely created by the impact. A local farmer was the first to spot the object falling to Earth and brought word of what he found to his village. At the same time, a Level 4 SCP Foundation agent stationed in the area detected elevated levels of radioactivity and traced the source back to the crater. An SCP collection squad led by General Mulhausen was dispatched to the impact site and quickly secured the area. Test subjects from the nearby village were recruited for initial analysis of the object, with 3 men being individually sent inside of SCP-002, all of whom disappeared. Having confirmed this anomaly's deadly properties, General Mulhausen then issued a Level 4A termination order that would apply to any local witnesses in order to ensure that no knowledge of the object reached the outside world. He then oversaw its transport to an SCP containment facility. As Foundation staff prepped SCP-002 for relocation, 4 members of the security personnel were seemingly mesmerized and drawn inside the object where they too disappeared. This was the first hint that SCP-002 possesses some form of subtle mind control, with the ability to influence humans into stepping inside of it. It was after these losses that it was first noticed that the object appeared to grow new furnishings, following someone disappearing inside. After these mishaps, General Mulhausen ordered all staff to wear hazmat suits when dealing with SCP-002, and following the General's own termination, SCP-002 was placed in containment at the secure facility where it currently resides. Due to the ongoing danger presented by SCP-002, the risk it poses to any who step inside of it, and the mind control abilities it possesses, it has been classified as Euclid. It is to remain connected at all times to a suitable power supply to keep it in a charging mode of some kind, which appears to make it more docile. In the event of a power outage, staff in the immediate area are to be evacuated and the object's containment cell emergency barrier is to be closed, sealing it off from the rest of the site. Once power is reestablished, strobing X-ray and ultraviolet lights are to be activated in the containment cell until SCP-002 is returned to its charging mode. Research teams investigating SCP-002 that will come within 20 meters of the object must consist of no fewer than 2 members. Personnel should also maintain physical contact with one another at all times to confirm that the other is present and not experiencing any feelings of confusion, dulled perception, or other forms of bewilderment that may lead to them entering the living room. No personnel at all below a Level 3 clearance are allowed inside of SCP-002, and any staff that have contact with the anomaly are to be escorted no less than 5 kilometers away and must undergo a 72-hour quarantine and psychological evaluation. SCP-002 is one of the oldest anomalies in the SCP Foundation database, but remains one of the least understood. Perhaps one day we'll understand what it is and why it was at one time sitting in the orbit of Earth. Did someone send it here, intending us to one day find it? Did it come here of its own volition? Or did we put it there ourselves, in an attempt to keep it away? A doctor frantically writes in his journal, "It's almost impossible to believe everything that's transpired has taken place in such a short amount of time. It all began 3 days ago.
It was just another day down in the mines. A worker was drilling into a seam of coal when suddenly there was an issue with the rig. From what I've gathered, it sounds like the drill bit exploded due to some kind of mechanical defect, sending shards of metal flying throughout the tunnel. The worker was lucky that none of the large pieces struck him, as they surely would have been fatal. He had, though, still been grazed by a piece of shrapnel from the ruined drill bit, and it had left a deep cut across his upper arm. Other miners who were working nearby heard the commotion and quickly came to his aid. They applied a tourniquet to stem the flow of blood and helped him to the mine shaft elevator for the long ride to the surface. Once they reached the safety of daylight, they brought the injured man to the on-site medical clinic, where I was on duty at the time. I cleaned the wound since there was a substantial amount of coal dust that had gotten inside, before suturing and bandaging it. The miner was sent to his bunkhouse to recover, and I thought that would be the end of it. Of course, it was only the beginning. Roughly 24 hours later, the same miner presented himself to me once again. I asked about his injury, and he explained that while his arm was fine, he now felt like he might be coming down with an illness. His symptoms included a runny nose, a cough, and body aches, so my assumption was that he'd simply had some bad luck and caught a cold that just so happened to coincide with being injured on the job. I sent him to his bunk once again, telling him that he wouldn't be able to work and should instead use the day to rest and recover. The next day, I was once again in the clinic when my phone rang. It wasn't the sick miner, but instead his supervisor. The miner hadn't shown up for his shift that morning, and he asked for me to go check on him since he knew he hadn't been feeling well. I agreed that it was strange that neither of us had heard anything else from the miner and went to see him straight away. I entered the bunkhouse where many of the workers stay while on site at this remote mine. It was empty, except for the injured miner who was still in his bed. As I approached, I could immediately tell something was very wrong. The man was curled up in the fetal position and was sweating profusely while also shivering. A quick touch of his forehead revealed that the man had a high fever, too. He was practically incoherent, seemingly delirious from his high temperature. The miner was moved to the empty bed inside the clinic so I could better observe and tend to him, but very carefully since I assumed now that he was actually suffering from influenza and didn't want to risk an outbreak at the mine. I was getting ready to administer fluids to the miner, who was still mumbling incomprehensibly, when I noticed something on his face. It appeared that he was crying, but the tears that ran down his cheeks weren't made of water. They were blood. I hadn't seen anything like it before. There was no reason why influenza should be causing this man to cry tears of blood. I could see the veins in his forehead starting to pulse, as if his blood pressure had suddenly skyrocketed. And just as I was leaning in to get a closer look, something horrible happened. The miner suddenly opened his mouth and expelled an enormous stream of blood. The blast of blood struck me in the face and knocked me backwards in fright as the man continued expelling more and more blood from his mouth, which soon covered the walls of the clinic. With seemingly all the blood having been discharged from his body, the man then went limp. I attempted to resuscitate him, but strangely, there was no need. The man was comatose, but he was alive. There I was, standing in the middle of the clinic over the man, both he, myself, as well as the room completely covered in blood. It was one of the worst things I'd ever experienced as a doctor, and yet somehow, it was about to get even worse. I was still in shock from what had just happened when I heard the door to the clinic open behind me. I turned around to see a group of half a dozen more miners from the site, each one coughing, sweating, and shivering. One held a cloth to his ear that was stained red, while another attempted to stop his nose from bleeding. Whatever had infected the first patient wasn't a one-off medical event. This had the makings of an epidemic. I knew that I was in way over my head. I was just a general practitioner, not an infectious disease specialist, and I called the Center for Disease Control to get their guidance. I was told to quarantine the sick men as best I could, and that a rapid response team would be sent who were better equipped to deal with potential outbreaks. While I waited for the CDC to arrive, I began moving the afflicted men to a bunkhouse that had been designated for quarantining. Several more also began expelling huge amounts of blood, though unlike the first patient, none of the others survived the traumatic event. As I was putting the final infected man into a bed, I noticed something, though. There was a huge amount of heat radiating off of his lower body, and when I pulled down the blankets, I discovered something that even with all of the strange happenings, I still couldn't believe. There were huge lumps growing on his legs. each of which looked to be filled with some kind of fluid or gas, and they were extremely hot to the touch, as if the chemicals inside the lumps were creating a source of heat. As I was investigating the bizarre growths, I suddenly looked up to see that the man was no longer in a state of delirium. Instead, a crazed look had come over his eyes, and he suddenly leapt out of bed, flailing and clawing at me as if he wanted to kill me. I don't know how, but I was able to fight off the man and run out of the bunkhouse. He gave chase, though, and with no other option, I ran into a nearby storage shed. The man was beating and scratching at the door, but I was able to barricade it by dragging a heavy shelf in front of it. After several minutes of trying to break inside, he finally gave up and left. And here I remain. I'm too afraid to go back out. It seems that if the disease won't kill me, then whatever it is turning people into will. All I can do is wait for the CDC team to get here and hopefully know how to deal with whatever this situation has become. The doctor closes his small notebook and notices a drop of something fall onto the cover. He reaches up and wipes his hand across his mouth. It comes back, covered in blood. The doctor didn't know what the disease was that had so rapidly spread through the workers at the mine, nor did the CDC response team when they arrived. No, it wasn't until the SCP Foundation caught word of the mysterious outbreak that someone would finally determine what was happening with what would soon be called SCP-016, which is also known as the Sentient Micro-Organism. SCP-016 is a blood-borne pathogen that was first discovered after a worker at a remote mine was injured while drilling into a coal seam deep beneath the earth. It is theorized that coal dust entered the wound, dust which perhaps carried dormant spores of what would become SCP-016. Over the next several days, all of the remaining employees at the mine were infected, as was the CDC crisis team that was sent to the mine to investigate the outbreak of what was potentially an undiscovered pathogen. Following the CDC's inability to deal with the disease, the SCP Foundation took over the site and quickly terminated all affected personnel in order to prevent further spread. The first infected person, Patient 0, was taken into Foundation custody for further investigation, and the mine shaft itself was collapsed by an explosive device in order to seal it off. After studying Patient 0, the Foundation learned a great deal about just what they were dealing with. What they found was that SCP-016 has an incubation period that can vary wildly from just 24 hours to as long as 2 years, with the length appearing to be dependent on the number of other potential human hosts in the immediate area. Once symptoms begin to present in an individual, they will at first look to be quite similar to the common cold. They can include coughing, a runny nose, itchy eyes, and body aches. Roughly 48 hours after the first symptoms, the infected person will experience a form of hemorrhagic fever similar to the Ebola virus, which causes a small amount of bleeding in the lungs. This leads to the infected blood becoming aspirated, most likely in order to better spread through the air. The third stage of the disease leads to the host crashing and bleeding out as they start to bleed profusely from multiple body orifices, including the nose, tear ducts, mouth, and even through the pores of their skin. Their blood pressure will also skyrocket during this final stage, and in some cases have vomited blood as far as 5 meters. Oddly enough, although most die from the traumatic event, this almost complete exsanguination will not always result in death. Sometimes, following the removal of almost all blood from the body, the patient will somehow survive, and the pathogen inside their body will return to its dormant phase once again, before eventually repeating the process. But SCP-016 is more than just a rapid and often deadly blood-borne disease, as you will soon see. As SCP researchers studied the disease, what they discovered was that it had a very strange property that sets it apart from other hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola and the Marburg virus. What they found was that when someone infected with SCP-016 is placed into a high-stress situation, such as one where their life is being threatened, SCP-016 will transition from rapidly reproducing inside of its host's body to instead begin rewriting their host's actual DNA. This genetic manipulation, combined with the stimulation of rapid cell division, leads to the host undergoing major physiological changes and in extremely small amounts of time. In just 24 hours, the host can begin showing physical changes to their body, and a complete bodily reconstruction can occur in less than 2 weeks. Most of the hosts who begin to undergo physical changes will not survive the process, due to how heavily the transformation stresses the body, but those that do will be changed in more than just physical ways. They'll exhibit hyper-aggressive behaviors, not dissimilar to those infected by rabies. And it's theorized that the pathogen may cause this behavior in order to better spread the virus. When the Foundation realized that SCP-016 was capable of these transformative effects, they immediately undertook a number of experiments on D-Class personnel in order to better understand their full extent. In the first test, a D-Class was infected with SCP-016, and as soon as they began showing symptoms, their cell was slowly flooded with water in order to stimulate the life-threatening situation needed to trigger the transformation process. Over the next 24 hours, researchers watched as the subject appeared to develop gills, which would allow it to survive in the now water-filled cell. The transformations didn't stop there, though, and over the next 2 weeks, the subject also had their limbs change into fins, their eyesight deteriorated, and their sense of hearing increased as they developed an echolocation ability very similar to the one employed by whales and dolphins. The experiment was concluded by removing all of the water from the cell, leading to the death of the subject from asphyxiation, as they could no longer breathe in the open air. A similar experiment was performed on another D-Class, but this time, instead of taking on aquatic animal properties, the D-Class experienced rapid muscle growth and their knuckles grew bone-like protrusions. It attempted to use both of these to break through the door of their flooding cell, but they were unable to breach the reinforced steel and soon died from drowning. The Foundation now knew that the virus could react in different ways to the same situation. The same experiment was run a third time, but in this instance, the infected D-Class exhibited an entirely different means of trying to escape. The subject had a massive growth appear on its chest, which seemed to be fed from 2 different tubes of flesh, also emanating from the subject's body. Fearing what it planned to do, the Foundation ended the experiment early and terminated the subject. An autopsy revealed that the growth was actually a hollow chamber that was being fed by the tubes with oxygen and acetylene gas, which when combined in sufficient amounts would cause a massive combustion event. In other words, SCP-016 was turning the subject into a living bomb. Moving on from flooded cell tests, the researchers next left the D-Class inside of a room with no stressing elements, and instead told them to focus on growing a pair of wings. Without any reason to begin the transformation process, SCP-016 went through its normal stages, and the subject died from blood loss without any other changes occurring. In the final test, a D-Class was placed inside of an acrylic box that was suspended over a mine shaft, with a timer attached indicating the time when the bottom of the box would open and drop the D-Class into the 1,000-foot deep shaft. This D-Class was also told to focus on growing wings that would allow them to survive the plunge. The subject began to transform over the next 24 hours, but rather than grow wings, they instead developed a tentacle-like appendage on their arm that was capable of producing silk similar to a spider's spinneret. They used the silk-producing organ to secure themselves to the box, showing that subjects did not appear to be able to control the way in which SCP-016 would alter their bodies. This experiment concluded when the timer reached 0 and the bomb attached to it detonated, as had been the plan all along. Following this last test, SCP-016 samples were placed into containment, and access to the sample for experimental purposes is only allowed with prior authorization from Level 4 or 05 personnel, with full documentation of the proposed experiment required beforehand. Failure to follow any of these procedures will lead to the offending personnel being reassigned to D-Class duty or terminated. SCP-016 has been classified as Keter, and the only existing sample is kept in a petri dish which is under extreme lockdown inside of a 5x5 by 5 meter room, where the temperature is kept below 0 degrees Celsius at all times. Should an outbreak of SCP-016 occur, all infected personnel are to be immediately terminated on site, and if the infection cannot be contained within 48 hours, then the on-site nuclear device is to be detonated prior to any additional personnel being evacuated. While the containment procedures may sound callous, unfortunately, when it comes to anomalous pathogens as dangerous as SCP-016, no chances can be taken.
A man wakes up with a start. Did something just bite him? He looks down at his hand. Something definitely bit him. He can see the red welt already forming. He looks around for the culprit, but can't find it anywhere. He really hopes he doesn't have bed bugs. That's the last thing he needs right now. He'll have to keep his eyes open for potential pests. He doesn't want this to happen again, since the spot is already starting to itch and feel uncomfortable. A couple days pass, though, with no signs of other bugs. It must have just been a random insect that came inside his house to escape the winter cold. The spot on his hand felt a little rough for a day or two, but now he's pretty much forgotten all about it. Now what he really needs is some coffee before sitting down to another coding session. The man is in his kitchen trying to make a fresh pot of coffee, but finds he's having a hard time. He's not so much making coffee as he is making a mess. He knocks his favorite mug onto the ground, breaking it, and decides that maybe he doesn't need coffee after all. A couple of nights later, as the man is watching TV, he starts to cough. Just a little at first, but then more and more. The coughing fits get longer and deeper too, like they are coming from the very bottom of his lungs. He hopes he isn't coming down with something. He hasn't left the house in days, so how could he have? Can bugs transfer colds? He'll have to look it up later. For now, he needs to do something about this cough. He won't be able to sleep if it keeps up. He needs to go get some medicine. The man gets bundled up and heads out. It's lightly snowing as he walks to the pharmacy, and he can't help but admire the way the moon hangs in the sky, a beautiful beacon of light on this dark winter evening. Inside the pharmacy, he finds the cold medicine section and picks out a cough suppressant. He takes it to the counter and decides to get a few candy bars too. He's developed a real sweet tooth these last few days. The man starts to cough again. It's a good thing he's getting this medicine. Several more days pass, and the man isn't feeling any better. This cough just won't go away. He decides it's finally time to go see a doctor. As he sits in the doctor's office waiting room, he does his best to hold in his coughs, but he has a very hard time. The woman on the other side of the room is coughing too. Strangely, it actually makes him feel a little better. There must just be something going around. A nurse comes into the waiting room and calls his name. The doctor is ready for him. The man is sitting on the bed in the examination room when the doctor enters. He's looking over his medical records and doesn't even look up from his clipboard. He tells the man to take off his shirt so that he can be examined, and the man obliges. "Okay, let's see what the trouble is," the doctor says. He finally looks up at the man and screams. It didn't take long for the SCP Foundation to hear the reports of people's limbs metamorphosing into insectoid appendages, and they knew immediately what they were dealing with. This was another outbreak of the parasitic, limb-transforming insect known as SCP-150. SCP-150 is an obligate parasite, meaning that it requires a host for the completion of its reproductive life cycle. It bears a visual appearance similar to that of Cymathoa exigua, another parasite that eats the tongue of a particular type of fish before replacing the tongue with its own body. SCP-150 engages in similar behavior, though it appears to exclusively affect humans. When a human comes in contact with the small bug-like organism, it will embed itself under its new host's skin. Next, over the course of roughly 7 days, SCP-150 will burrow deep into the host's flesh and begin to cause numerous physiological changes to them. First, and most prominently, SCP-150 will begin a gradual process of altering the limb that is nearest to the original infection site. As SCP-150 burrows deeper and consumes the flesh, it excretes a substance that has the effect of replacing the missing sections of the limb with a hard, chitinous material that resembles one of its own appendages. Beneath the chitin, the excreted substance forms a rudimentary nervous system that gives the host the ability to control the new limb as if it were their own. As it feeds, SCP-150 also secretes several chemicals that contain anesthetic, immunosuppressant, and transplant-rejecting properties that keep the host's body from responding to the changes, or even reacting at all. In fact, the host will often report that their new limb is completely normal and feels stronger and more resilient after the transformation. SCP-150 will continue to feed for approximately 1 to 2 weeks, and as it feeds on the nutrients within its host's body, it will begin to reproduce, creating eggs that it deposits directly into the bloodstream. While the majority of these eggs will die off, enough usually survive to begin colonizing other parts of the host's body, where they will hatch and repeat the process of feeding, reproducing, and spreading more eggs. It is theorized that it is capable of reproducing on its own, meaning that a single instance of SCP-150 is all it takes to create a new colony. Humans infected with SCP-150 will sometimes report slight discomfort and issues with their fine motor skills during this period, but will usually not express any knowledge of what might be causing this. Eventually, SCP-150 eggs will reach the host's lungs, where the process of assimilating continues, this time replacing the lungs themselves. During this process, more eggs will be produced, laid, and then spread out of the body by the host's coughing. As many as 10,000 eggs will be produced during this period, approximately 1% of which will survive being expelled, find another host, and implant themselves. The assimilation process then spreads to the central nervous system, including the spinal cord and brain, but strangely, the host will show no signs that their consciousness or behavior have been affected in any way. In interviews with hosts of SCP-150, those who are unaware that they are infected have not expressed any knowledge of changes happening in or out of their body. When subjects are made aware that they have been infected, they will be able to point out the site of the original infection and agree that a change has taken place, but they seem to have no ill will towards their new chitinous appendages and will often express positive feelings about it. In order to better study the effects of SCP-150 under SCP Foundation control, 2 D-Class personnel, D-13732 and D-016002, were both infected with the parasites, and the assimilation process was allowed to fully progress through all the stages. Following signs that D-016002 was experiencing swelling of the brain, a decompressive craniotomy was performed, a procedure in which a portion of the skull is removed in order to relieve pressure on the brain. This surgery had the added benefit of giving Foundation researchers the chance to look at SCP-150's progress firsthand. But after a flap of her skull was removed, the attending scientists did not find that her brain was swelling. They didn't find her brain at all, but instead observed numerous instances of SCP-150 in the cavity where her brain should be. The D-Class had been partially anesthetized to numb her skull but remained conscious during the procedure, and the scientists asked her several simple questions to which she was perfectly able to answer. They began removing some of the parasites, and as they did so, her answers became slower and less clear. It appeared that the SCP-150 instances had not just eaten and replaced her brain, they had become her brain. For the next experiment, they would use the instances of SCP-150 that had been removed from D-13732's nervous system after he had been euthanized following the discovery that his entire nervous system had also been replaced entirely by SCP-150. The parasites taken from his brain cavity were placed into D-016002's, and the results were nothing short of incredible. After observing a period of time where the organisms appeared to move and rearrange themselves within her skull, she regained consciousness. Once awake, not only did her cognitive functions immediately improve, when she was asked to state her name, she told them it was Michael, D-13732's name. It is unknown why SCP-150 engages in this peculiar life cycle, but the danger it poses to humans and the difficulty in keeping it contained has led the SCP Foundation to classify it as Keter. Some of the more erudite researchers have taken to calling the parasite the ship of Theseus, a play on the philosophical notion that questions whether something that has had all of its parts replaced is still fundamentally the same, or if it has become something new. Perhaps the observation of those infected with SCP-150 can shed some light on this millennia-old question. Infected patients who are being studied are to be kept in Level 3 biohazard containment cells, with never more than 1 infected host per cell. Cultures of SCP-150 adults and eggs are kept in vacuum-sealed glass flasks in the Site-42 Infectious Materials Lab, and the Foundation's standard pathogen handling procedures are required to be followed at all times. Should any instance of SCP-150 be found outside of containment, it is to be immediately incinerated.
A worker presses down on the plunger, and moments later, a huge explosion rocks the quarry. When the dust clears, the 3 quarry workers look on at the pile of rocks that they'll now spend the next days and weeks hauling out. But then, they spot something strange. There in the newly exposed rock face is an opening. The 3 men stand at the mouth of the previously hidden cave. They poke their heads inside, but it's too dark to see much of anything, except for the fact that the tunnel in the rock stretches on for at least a few meters before it turns and prevents them from seeing any further. One of the quarry workers slaps his coworker on the back and dares him to go inside and check it out. "No way," he tells him as he pulls his hand back from feeling inside the cave wall, his palm now coated in a sickly slime. "It's gross in there." The other 2 laugh at him. If they think they're so brave, why don't the 2 of them go check it out? The 2 men stop laughing and look at each other. Who could have ever foreseen the tables turning on them like this? But they're not going to back down. One of the 2 takes out a flashlight,
and they step into the cave while the third waits outside. He watches as the two of them head deeper into the cave, disappearing behind the bend. Inside the cave, the floor is just like the walls, coated with some kind of substance making it wet, but also a little sticky. They half expected the cave to end right around the bend, but now they can see that it continues on. Not only is there another turn several meters ahead of them, but as they head deeper in, they find that there are branching paths too. This might just be the start of a vast cave system. There's no telling how far or how deep it might go. They better head back to the entrance before they get lost. The two turn around to start heading back towards the entrance. But wait, what was that? They spin around. It sounded like there was a noise behind them. But there's nothing there, just the empty passageway. They must be hearing things. They really should get out of here quickly, though. Come on, let's go. As they turn to leave, though, something happens. With a sickening squishing sound, the walls of the tunnel constrict, closing up between them. He runs towards the now closed passage and starts slapping at the moist, soft wall, but there's no response. But then he does hear something. Was that a scream? He's realized something else, too. Even though his friend had the flashlight, he can still see. While faint, the walls themselves seem to be producing a small amount of light. He yells out that he's going to get help and that his friend should hold tight and not move. He'll get him out of there. He has no idea if he can hear him, though. He starts to slowly make his way back the way he thinks they came, but the cave feels different. He's taking turns that he doesn't remember making on their short trip. He should be at the entrance already, and there seem to be more branching paths than there were before. It's hard to tell in the low light, though. Maybe he's just confused. He's hearing noises, too. Wet, writhing sounds. He's got to get out of here. The quarry worker reaches a fork in the tunnel and has no idea which is the right way to go. He doesn't remember this at all. He calls down the tunnel, but there's no answer to his cries. He hears more of those wet, slapping sounds behind him, though. He's got to keep moving. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. The left tunnel it is. He goes down his chosen path, rounds a corner, and sees another fork. What is going on here? He's got to pick, though. Eeny, meeny, miny. He screams as something leaps out of the tunnel at him. Outside the cave, the quarry worker is growing nervous. He's gotten a flashlight of his own and shines it down the tunnel, but he can't see any more than they could before. He calls out, asking if they're all right, but he's met only with silence. He turns around behind him at the empty quarry. They're the only ones working on the site that day, and if they don't get back to work soon, there's going to be some angry questions about why they spent the day horsing around inside of a cave. As much as he hates the idea, he's got to go in there and get them out. He enters the cave and goes around the first bend. He too notices how oddly sticky and slimy every surface is, but he has to press on. Maybe they were hurt and needed his help. He rounds another bend and spots something, a pair of legs sticking out from around the next turn. His friend must really have been hurt. He runs towards his injured coworker and kneels down next to him. It looks like he's passed out on the ground, and he tries to shake him awake. "Are you okay? What happened?" His friend moans a bit, but doesn't even open his eyes. He moans again, and this time blood starts pouring out of his mouth. The quarry worker steps back, scared at the sight of his friend's state. That's when he notices something. His friend's stomach. It's moving. He leans in close. He can see bumps swelling and moving around his abdomen. Is that? The SCP Foundation soon learned of the troubling reports and moved quickly to purchase the quarry and the surrounding lands. Those who had seen or heard rumors about the missing workers were amnesticized, and all further access to the area around the quarry was strictly controlled. The cave itself that had been unearthed was designated SCP-2385, but the Foundation needed to learn just what they were dealing with. So after a research outpost was constructed over the entrance, the investigation into what was happening inside this strange anomalous cavern system could finally begin. The first to enter the cave is D-11424, a Class D personnel, who is equipped with a shoulder-mounted camera, a Ruger LC-9 pistol, a machete, and 1 week's worth of rations, since it was unknown just how vast this cave system may be. D-11424 proceeds into the cave and immediately reports back the same conditions that the workers had experienced, that the surfaces of the cave were soft, wet, and a little sticky, and also that they seemed to have an almost imperceptible glow. D-11424 moves deeper into the cave, but sees no sign of the missing workers, despite one of their bodies having been reported as being lost relatively close to the entrance. He's ordered to continue deeper into the cave, and radios back that the walls weren't stable. He would pass by openings in the walls that would seal off once he was past. On more than one occasion, he saw new passages open up as well, and these didn't appear to be caused by collapses or other geological activity. The walls seemed like they were alive. But the walls were the only sign of life he could find. There was still no evidence of the missing workers or whatever might have gotten them. But then, after D11424 rounds a corner, he sees that something is up ahead of him. It's not one of the workers. It's a creature, and one that looks like nothing he has ever seen before. The thing crawling on the floor of the cave looks like a giant worm, several feet in length, but with a grotesque, skinless human head. D11424, frightened at the sight of this grotesque creature, turns to run, but it's too late. The worm has spotted him and charges at him immediately, slithering across the wet cave floor at an incredible speed. D11424 slips and falls to the ground, his shoulder-mounted camera knocked off his body and left facing a wall, leaving the researchers monitoring the feed with nothing except the sound of his screams. Once contact was lost with the Class D personnel, the Foundation decided that due to the presence of hostile creatures within the cave system, that the next exploratory expedition would be undertaken without humans. The mission was authorized, and 2 months later, a remote-controlled drone designated A47 was sent into the cave. Just like D11424 and the quarry workers before saw, its camera captures passageways opening and closing in the living rock walls. As it progresses deeper, it eventually spots the same worm-like creatures with horrible human faces that look like they've had their skin removed, which have now been designated by the Foundation as SCP-2385-1 entities. And A47 soon discovers a surprising fact about these bizarre organisms. They appear that they are being birthed right from the walls of the cave itself. As A47 enters one of those largest rooms yet seen in the cave, its camera captures over a dozen 2385-1s growing out of the walls and ceiling in various stages of maturity. Some of them snap at A47 as it passes by, trying to attack the drone, but luckily they're unable to reach. There's larger examples of the worms in the room too, and these ones also differ in appearance slightly, with a fibrous growth over their eyes. The researchers assume that these entities are different enough from the smaller versions that they warrant their own classification, and are designated as SCP-2385-2 entities. Luckily for A47, these larger specimens, which can be as large as 4 meters in length, seem much more docile than their smaller counterparts and ignore A47 as it passes by. A47 then learns another shocking piece of information about these disturbing worm-like creatures. They're cannibalistic. Its camera relays footage back to the research team of a 2385-1 entity feeding on another, smaller one. It appears that they eat their prey whole after unhinging their grotesque jaws. The one feeding tries to lash out at A47 with its tail, but can't reach him with half of another instance in its mouth, and the drone continues deeper into the cave. Just when A47 enters the next chamber, a 2385-1 instance growing out of the ceiling drops down right in front of it, leaving no way for the drone to get around it in the narrow section of cave. A47 quickly turns around to seek out another path, but its camera captures the passage closing in front of it. A47 is trapped. The 2385-1 entity charges towards the remote-controlled drone and attacks, biting and slapping it with its powerful tail. It then attempts to consume it, but is unable to ingest the bulky drone and, instead, leaves the heavily damaged robot for dead, slithering away deeper into the cave. The battered drone lies immobile on the cave floor for several hours, its camera broadcasting until the last of its battery is finally about to run out. Just before it stops sending signals back to the research outpost, though, it captures something. The wall next to A47 opens up, and 2 of the larger SCP-2385-2 entities emerge from the new passageway. One of them approaches A47, as the other probes at the wall next to it with its head. It seems as though the larger of the entities are actually able to form new pathways in the cave, or at least open up doorways between existing ones. With the last of its battery power, A47 sends back a truly remarkable sight. Out of the hole opened by the 2385-2 entity appears D11424. He's dirty, disheveled, sporting a month's worth of beard growth, and brandishing a machete. The wall opens up from the -2 entity prodding at it, and the odd group exits through it. It's the last thing A-47 transmits back to the Foundation. 2 months later, after several more failed manned missions, there was finally a success. An SCP-2385-2 instance that had wandered close to the entrance was retrieved from the cave system and brought back to a Foundation research site where a camera was surgically implanted in its head. The entity, which was designated as Subject Alpha, or SA, was then amnestetized and released back into the 2385 caves, allowing researchers to monitor how it behaved as it traveled through its home environment. The researchers watched as SA made its way through the cave system and stopped in another of the rooms filled with young versions of 2385-1. The larger entity approached several and appeared to nuzzle its face against theirs before moving on, which looked to have a calming effect on the extremely aggressive smaller versions. As it continues through the tunnels, SA sees a group of 2385-1 instances feeding on a deceased 2385-2. It appears that when 2385-1s are unable to swallow their prey whole, they burrow into the body and consume them from the inside out. Luckily, they are too distracted by their meal to pay any attention to SA, and it is able to pass by. SA then runs into 2 other 2385-2 entities, and the 3 begin traveling through the caves together. They are soon attacked by a smaller -1, but the group is able to pin the biting and thrashing entity to the ground with their powerful tails, allowing SA to nuzzle it. Just like with the ones being birthed from the wall, this seems to calm the creature, but there is another effect as well. As the 2385-1 entity becomes more docile, the same fibrous growths that can be seen on the larger 2385-2 entities start to grow over its eyes. Is this how 2385-2s are created? The group of -2s continues their journey through the tunnels, often stopping to prod at the walls to open new pathways. It appears that they are searching for something, looking around each new room they enter before moving on. Eventually, they run into something, but it doesn't appear to be what they wanted to find. They enter a new section of cave, and blocking the path in front of them is the largest SCP-2385-1 entity yet recorded. It's as big as the -2s at over 7 meters in length and weighing an estimated 400 kilograms. It appears to be extremely hostile, but the -2s seem to instinctively know that the only way forward is to go past this massive -1. The trio nuzzles their heads together as if they are saying one final goodbye before one of the -2s charges straight ahead. The -1 attacks and quickly incapacitates it with its powerful tail and snapping jaws. It begins feeding on the -2, giving SA and its one remaining companion the time they need to get past. As the now duo moves past, the other is attacked from a side tunnel by a group of regular-sized but ferocious -1s. SA can't do anything to help. It seems to pick up the pace and continues on, but as it rounds a corner, it comes face-to-face with another large -1 instance. It turns down a side tunnel to avoid it, but finds itself in a dead end. It prods at the wall as the -1 rushes towards it, but no new passageways open. It turns around, seemingly resigned to its fate as the -1 begins attacking. But just then, something else appears in the tunnel coming towards them. It's D-11424, charging forward with his machete raised in the air, his hair and beard both long and wild. He begins fighting the large -1 entity, hacking at it with his machete until it finally dies. With the vicious entity now dead, he kneels down next to SA and begins stroking its head in a calming manner. "Hey there, little guy. You all right?" he asks as he pets the 2385-2. "Yeah, you're fine. Get up. I know where it is. Come with me." SA struggles from its injuries, but is able to follow D-11424 as he leads it through the tunnels, with D-11424 stopping at one point to carve a piece off of the fleshy walls and consume it. The tunnels eventually open up into a large room that looks similar to the rest of the cave system, except there is a huge glowing orb at its center. It's a beautiful sphere of warm light that appears to be at least 10 meters in diameter. "Here we are," the D-Class tells SA, and motions towards the orb. "It's all right." SA nuzzles against D-11424, perhaps one final thank you for saving its life, then instinctually seems to know what to do. The camera feed shows that it began crawling towards the sphere, and after a brief pause, started pushing itself inside. The camera recorded the brilliant light of the orb engulfing SA and its implanted camera before the feed finally cut out. The SCP Foundation would later discover that on that very same day, in the city of Elgin, Illinois, a local woman was admitted to the hospital after complaining of abdominal pains. Doctors performed emergency surgery and found something they did not expect. a micro camera had somehow become embedded inside of her body, which upon later investigations would be found to bear the same serial number as the one that had been implanted in SA. Following this strange event, SCP-00385, which had previously been classified as Euclid, was upgraded to Keter. An observation site has been built at the quarry and no further human expeditions are allowed inside. In a bit of good news, sometime later, D-11424 finally emerged from the cave system. He was taken back into SCP Foundation custody and continues engaging in exploratory missions on behalf of the Foundation to this day.
The plan had sounded so simple, the thief thinks to himself, one of many thoughts that ring loudly in his panicking brain. He wished he could hit a magic undo button to take everything back from the second it all started to unravel, anything to reverse what happened to the prisoner. Except, it's too late. The beast lumbering through the dark lab is no longer the person that the thief once knew. It's not even human anymore. And what makes that fact even worse is knowing that it's all his fault. As he hears the heavy step of something more closely resembling a blob than a foot, the thief wishes he'd never found out about that cursed locket. Little more than a few months earlier, the would-be thief isn't quite ready to enact his plan yet. In fact, the idea hasn't even entered his mind and won't until a chance meeting. It's during this time that he's just an average researcher, working in the ranks of the SCP Foundation. Well, as average as someone in that line of work can be, which is to say he's a researcher who doesn't have the power to nullify reality-warping powers around him and is just an ordinary human rather than a talking dog in a lab coat. Chances are, if he avoids the encounter he's about to have, then our researcher could have a long-lasting future at the Foundation ahead of him. Not as the head of any of the major research departments, of course, more as an upper-middle management type, never really experiencing the safety and fulfillment that comes from making it to the top of the food chain, but still having a few researchers below his station that he can boss around whenever he's having a bad day. That course of action will all be averted, though, when he meets the prisoner. Sent to deliver a file to another member of personnel in the medical bay, the researcher catches the eye of the prisoner, a D-class personnel, denoted by the uniform. They get to talking, a perfectly innocent conversation. Then, as the days and weeks pass, the two of them see each other again and again. The prisoner never leaves the medical wing, confined to an uncomfortable bed. But despite all the discomfort he's experiencing, conversing with the researcher soon becomes the highlight of his days. It doesn't ease the pain, but it distracts him from it, at least for a few moments. After some time passes, the two's topic of conversation eventually turns to what landed the prisoner on this gurney in the first place. That's when everything changes. The prisoner explains his predicament, and it's quite a sorry story. He's got a terminal illness, and worse, the Foundation gave it to him. They want to test out the capabilities of an anomalous locket that, apparently, has nearly limitless healing properties. But in order to do so, the Foundation knowingly contaminated the prisoner's bloodstream. Now he's in agony, his cells practically destroying themselves as he approaches the late stages. It's only when he reaches death's door that he'll be brought in for testing with the locket. However, that could mean weeks or even months of excruciating pain in the meantime. Hearing about all of this makes the researcher start to well up. He's only ever heard rumors of this anomalous locket and knows that he'd receive disciplinary punishment if he acted against the Foundation. And that would be the best-case scenario. Worst case, he'd probably find himself dosed up with amnestics and left on a sidewalk somewhere. But seeing the prisoner in so much pain, and knowing there was something on site that could help him, the researcher couldn't deny his own sense of empathy. And so, he vows to help. It'd be the kindest, most well-intentioned mistake he'd ever make. It's just a shame that, like they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The thief tries to sneak through the corridors of the facility as naturally as possible. Nobody can know what he's just done, how he's just betrayed the Foundation. It'll cost him his job, his future, his whole life. His trembling fingers grip the cool metal of the locket as it sits in the bottom of his lab coat pocket. He catches the eye of everyone he walks past, the fear that someone's onto him, thumping in his chest. Does he know? What about her? They look too. What if they found out? With the stolen locket firmly in his hand and his hand buried in his lab coat, he retraces his steps back towards the medical bay. One good deed for the prisoner. He'd use the locket to heal him up, then hurry back to the containment case to put it back where it belongs. That's the plan. Seeing the prisoner change before his very eyes somehow isn't the worst part. The formless mass of flesh that his body rapidly reforms into is certainly a horrific sight to behold, but to the thief, who could have just carried on as an uncaring researcher, the worst part is somehow the knowledge that the prisoner is gone. All that's left in his place is the monstrosity, and it's his fault. His good intention hadn't saved the man from his illness at all. Instead, hell is stalking the thief through the medical bay in the form of a terrifying flesh beast. And because no good deed goes unpunished, the unfortunate researcher turned thief doesn't live to see himself disciplined by his superiors at the Foundation. Instead, this newly created flesh beast reaches out and wraps its terrible claw around the researcher's throat. It tosses him across the room the way a child might carelessly throw a doll, and before he can stand, the creature is upon him, tearing into him with all its disgusting new appendages. It's the only ending you can expect when dealing with the Lovecraftian Locket. Jewelry. It's one of humanity's strange little quirks. Nowhere else in the world will you find another species, be it a mammal, an amphibian, a reptile, or otherwise, that finds joy in adorning its body with pieces of metal or precious stones. For some, jewelry is a signifier of wealth and status, and it's been that way for centuries. The crown jewels worn by kings in centuries gone by are just the precursor to someone wasting 6 months of their salary on a Rolex just to show off to their coworkers, who I guarantee aren't as impressed as they might pretend to be. Sorry, Gerald. Of course, in either case, there's nothing inherently special about any of these. They're all just material objects to be bought or sold. But let's say you were to possess a piece of jewelry that was actually special, perhaps even anomalous. Then you can bet that'd set it apart. In fact, anyone who's anyone would most likely pay top dollar to get their hands on something like that. Sadly, you'll never find SCP-047 up for auction or being appraised at a pawn shop, although that might be for the best. To understand exactly what SCP-047 is, where it came from, and what it can do, you'll need to first become familiar with another pair of anomalies that the SCP Foundation currently has in containment. First and foremost, SCP-500. While the origin of these seemingly mundane little pills isn't known, or is at least kept classified by the Foundation, what they can do has been well documented over the years. SCP-500 is a small plastic container that contains a remaining 47 anomalous red pills. These pills are known to have near instantaneous healing properties, able to not only treat, but outright cure any and all diseases. The potential of SCP-500's use is nearly limitless when it comes to remedying various dangerous afflictions, even anomalous ones. However, the limited number of pills available forces the Foundation to use them as sparingly as possible. They have conducted a number of cross-tests using the SCP-500 pills, particularly for correcting anomalous conditions such as SCP-008, otherwise known colloquially as the zombie plague. Given its name, you can probably imagine what this disease can do. However, a dose of SCP-500 is able to offer a subject infected with SCP-008 a full recovery, even if suffering from the advanced stages of this zombifying disease. Perhaps as a result of seeing how effective SCP-500 was at treating anomalous ailments, one Foundation researcher puts in a request to use one of the pills in an experiment involving a second SCP. This researcher is none other than Dr. Charles Gears, a respected, long-serving, and high-ranking member of Foundation personnel, albeit a man known to have a little trouble when it comes to expressing any sort of emotional response in any given situation. Nonetheless, it is Dr. Gears' suggestion for an SCP-500 cross-testing experiment that, although he has no idea, is inevitably going to lead to the creation of SCP-427. And in order to do so, will involve the use of another anomaly, SCP-914, better known as the Clockworks. SCP-914 is a collection of various clockwork components, a mass of springs, gyros, gears, and cogs, all forming one giant machine with two booths labeled Input and Output, respectively. There is a dial between both of these booths, denoting a number of settings ranging from rough to very fine. The purpose of this clockwork contraption? Well, that's simple. Based on what setting the dial is turned to, SCP-914 will either destroy, dismantle, recreate, or refine any item or being placed within the input booth. And when set to the highest setting, very fine, the item being improved is usually given anomalous properties. So can you guess what Dr. Gears' suggestion was? He puts in a request for one of the SCP-500 pills for testing with SCP-914. Not all requests are approved, given how limited the number of pills are, but knowing what the Clockworks is capable of, and that refining SCP-500 has the potential to create a more effective version of the all-curing red pills, the Foundation higher-ups grant approval for Dr. Gear's request. He's cleared to go ahead with his experiment, and so is given one of the SCP-500 pills to place into the Clockworks input booth. Turning the dial of SCP-914 to the Fine setting, which usually improves an item but rarely adds any anomalous properties to it, Dr. Gears takes a step back to a safe distance as the machine whirs to life. Components start turning and ticking, the Clockworks refining the little red pill it's been given, turning it from just one single dose into, well, not what anyone has been expecting. Dr. Gears perhaps most likely thought that SCP-914 would produce a new, more effective version of the SCP-500 pills. It's hard to see how a pill that cures all diseases could be improved upon, of course, but regardless, what the Clockworks turned that one pill into was perhaps the furthest thing Dr. Gears or anyone else thought they'd get out of this experiment. After the noise of the Clockworks grinding to life dies out, sitting in the output booth is an entirely new object. It's like the machine conjured it from out of thin air and made it brand new out of nowhere. It's not a pill, not even a serum, a topical ointment, or any other form of new and improved wonder drug. It's a locket, a piece of jewelry, an item that will henceforth be classified as SCP-427 once the Foundation learns exactly what this anomalous object can do. Naturally, Dr. Gears is eager to inspect and test out the capabilities of this new anomaly of his own, albeit accidental, creation. The locket itself is quite a beautiful thing, a small metallic sphere made of a polished silver substance decorated with ornate carvings. As quickly becomes evident, the carvings on the surface of SCP-427 don't actually serve any inherent purpose, they just make the locket itself look more like an elegant piece of jewelry. As Dr. Gears and his research team examine the locket, they notice no unusual or abnormal qualities presenting themselves, aside from the anomalous nature of SCP-427's creation. Although that's only as long as the small silver locket remains closed. When it is then opened up for examination purposes, that's when they find something curious inside. Within SCP-427, visible when it's opened up, is a small glowing orb contained in the center of the locket. Worried this orb might be dangerous, Dr. Gears orders an immediate test of the anomalous item's radiation levels, but luckily, it is quickly discovered that the object at its center emits no radiation or energy of any kind beyond the visible light energy that causes it to glow. But having SCP-427 open, that's when something strange happens. One of Dr. Gears' research assistants possessed some rather severe burns on his skin, the result of an accident that occurred when the assistant was a child. However, upon opening SCP-427, it quickly becomes evident that the scarring left behind from the assistant's unfortunate burns have been rapidly healed. Dr. Gears is astounded and instructs another of his colleagues to open up SCP-427. The hand-picked researcher has been suffering with the common cold, sniffling and coughing all over the facility. Normally, a minor infection like that takes between 3 to 10 days to make its way through the immune system and eventually leave. But as the phlegmy researcher stands in the presence of SCP-427 while the locket is open, his cold is rapidly cured in the space of only a few minutes. It is soon determined that the healing properties of SCP-427 are emitted directionally, meaning that someone has to be standing within direct line of sight of the glowing orb at the locket's center. And of course, it doesn't take long for additional testing to take place. Only a short while later, Dr. Gears is placing requests to his superiors within the Foundation for any and all members of D-Class personnel with any long-term illnesses, physical afflictions, or any otherwise damaged biological tissue to be reassigned to serve as test subjects for SCP-427. Much like the SCP-500 pill it was refined from, the anomalous locket seems to have near-limitless regenerative capabilities. But unlike the little red pills, there is no finite number to worry about. Just stand in line with the glowing orb within, and all that ails you is cured. With an object like SCP-427, the world could truly be healed of all diseases and injury. Illnesses could be removed from human life entirely. Maybe that's Dr. Gear's intention, despite how cold and emotionless he seems. After all, who wouldn't want to heal the world? But, like with a certain thief and a certain prisoner, Sometimes the noblest of intentions can lead to some nasty, unforeseen outcomes. The Foundation records don't indicate which was the first experiment with SCP-427 to produce the more undesirable side effect to its anomalous healing capabilities. Although knowing Foundation protocol, it's highly likely the subject of this experiment is a member of D-Class, and it's a safe bet that the outcome of such a disaster is what will give SCP-427 its new ominous nickname, the Lovecraftian Locket. The thing is, SCP-427 doesn't just heal, it improves. As it repairs cellular damage, acting in much the way SCP-500 does when taken orally, the Locket also optimizes the natural systems of a person's body. And in one subject in particular, the Foundation soon observes the risks that come with the overuse of SCP-427. We'll call this subject, our mystery member D-Class personnel, the patient. Following exposure to the Lovecraftian Locket, the patient's natural resistance to diseases, toxins, and other dangers to their immune system is increased by 500%. And that's only after 10 minutes of healing time from SCP-427. Better than full immunization against anything and everything. Curious to see how much further the Locket can improve a subject's natural resistances, if it even can at all, Dr. Gears and his researchers place the patient within the range of SCP-427's regenerative effect once again. This time, the exposure goes on for an extra 5 minutes, taking the duration up to 15. Monitoring all of the patient's vitals and charting any internal or external bodily change, the research team noticed that the patient seems to be getting stronger. Their muscular system is optimized, as if someone has programmed their body to its peak level of performance. Conducting further testing, Dr. Gears determined that the patient's pain tolerance and overall physical strength shows an increase of between 200 and 300%. Then they try exposing the patient again for over an hour this time, and that's when everything goes wrong. Before the researchers' very eyes, the patient's muscle and flesh start to mutate rapidly and uncontrollably. They shift from a normal human to a thing ripped straight out of a nightmare. What the Foundation scientists are only just realizing, in the most horrific fashion, is that the effects of SCP-427 are cumulative. They stack on top of one another, and continued exposure accelerates the amount of time it takes for the human body to apply the changes granted by the Locket, meaning that after so much exposure to SCP-427, the patient is converting at a rapid rate into a sickening, shapeless mass of tissue until they're not even human anymore, but a terrifying beast of nothing but flesh. These flesh beasts, as the researchers take to calling the creatures thanks to their horrific appearance, quickly prove to be highly aggressive. The security personnel that move in to contain the beast that was once the patient learned this in a quick, brutal fashion, as the newly formed flesh beast attacks the guards on site with messy, fatal results. Drawing their weapons, the surviving security officers open fire at the creature, which shows itself to be highly resistant to conventional firearms. Despite being comprised of flesh, the beast shrugs off bullets like they're little more than minor annoyances. Fortunately for the security personnel who haven't yet been slaughtered, they have a few other less conventional weapons on hand that might just do the trick. It takes a few unsuccessful tries and a lot of wasted ammo, but soon a successful way to neutralize the flesh beast is deployed. It turns out that a sufficient excess of heat, in excess of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, is enough to cause the flesh beast's bodily mass to combust. Given how aggressive the creatures are towards Foundation personnel during subsequent intentional attempts to recreate them, Dr. Gears and his fellow researchers can't gauge exactly how intelligent the flesh beasts are. But by mapping the biological optimizations that SCP-427 grants a subject, Foundation researchers have determined that the Lovecraftian Locket causes a significant enhancement to the brain, as well as the muscle and immune systems. After all, the brain is responsible for regulating all bodily functions. This means that the intelligence levels of a fully transformed flesh beast could exceed that of the average human. For now, despite the risks of mutation, SCP-427 is used as a partial replacement for the SCP-500 pills, given their limited number. While the Locket is able to cure any ailment that the pills can, total exposure time must be recorded, as the optimizations granted by SCP-427 are cumulative in all subjects. Given the potentially adverse side effects of continued SCP-427 use, only medical staff with a Class 3 clearance level are permitted to handle or use the Lovecraftian Locket. The O5 Council deems this to be an acceptable risk, and should anyone show any signs of sufficient mutations, they are to be terminated before they transform into a flesh beast. Any instances of a full mutation, now referred to as SCP-001, are to be killed immediately through means of incineration, since they are considered too aggressive to communicate with or experiment on. On second thought, perhaps I was a little too harsh on the Rolexes earlier.
Watch this, the teenage boy says before jumping his skateboard up onto the stair railing. His friends watch in amazement as he deftly guides his board down the long rail. They hoot and holler in support until suddenly, the boy seems to lose his balance. He falls from the rail and tumbles down the stairs of the large parking garage where they had been practicing their skateboarding tricks. The boy hits the ground at the end of the stairs, and all of his friends go quiet. The boy is stunned, but eventually he opens his eyes and stands up, but none of his friends can do anything except stare. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," the boy says as he looks down at his arm, which is now bent at a 90-degree angle in a spot where no joint should exist. The children watching all begin to scream, and one, unsure of what else to do, turns and runs. "What do I do? What do I do?" the boy with the broken arm says to no one and everyone. Luckily, one of the group quickly collects herself and steps forward to take control of the situation. "Come on," she says. "We're getting you to the hospital." The girl puts her arm around him on his non-damaged side and helps him to the street, where they have a stroke of good luck. Parked just a block away is an ambulance. "Hey!" the girl cries out, waving towards the ambulance. The paramedics inside must have seen her, because the ambulance's lights immediately come on and it drives the short distance to them. The ambulance stops and two paramedics quickly exit the vehicle. The paramedics don't even need to ask what happened. They can obviously see from the unnatural angle of the boy's arm that he needs immediate medical attention, and they quickly place him into the back of the ambulance. The girl begins to pull herself into the back as well, but is quite forcefully shoved back into the street. "Patients only," is the sole response from the paramedic who pushed her before he slams the door shut. The girl gets a brief look at her friend's frightened face through the back window as the ambulance speeds away. Several days later, the children are sitting outside of the same parking structure, but none of them are in any mood to skate. All they can think about is their missing friend. Neither the boy's parents nor the police have any idea what happened to him or where he went. There's no records at any of the local hospitals of him ever being brought there, nor does there seem to be any evidence of this particular ambulance having existed at all. No one even seems to believe the children that he got into an ambulance. The whole story just seems too far-fetched and outlandish, but the children know what they saw. As they discuss the events for the 100th or perhaps 1000th time, one of the smallest of the group suddenly stands up and points. "There it is!" The rest of the group looks in the direction he's motioning and sees the same thing. It's the ambulance. None of them know what to do as the vehicle flies past them, this time with no lights on, and comes to a stop a block away from where they first spotted it. They watch as the two paramedics exit the vehicle and go around to the back. It's hard to see from this distance, but it looks as though they took something out of the rear of the ambulance, something that requires both of them to lift, before dropping it on the sidewalk behind some trash cans. The children watch as the paramedics get back into the ambulance and drive away, disappearing just as quickly as they appeared. After a moment of shock, they all in unison begin running to the place where the ambulance stopped. They come to a skidding halt just in front of the trash cans. None of them can do anything except stare until they all break out into screams, one of the children turning and immediately running away. And they have good reason to scream, because in front of them is their friend. His arm is no longer broken, appearing to have been somehow repaired in just a matter of days, but it is also no longer attached to his shoulder. The boy opens his eyes as his friends scream, and looks down to see that his arms and legs have been reattached at a new angle, jutting out from his back, leaving him standing on all fours, his face staring up at the sky like some kind of twisted animal. What happened to this young man was tragic, but he wasn't the first victim of this strange malicious anomaly, and unfortunately, neither would he be the last, because this was SCP-4419, also known as the Butcher's Chariot. SCP-4419 appears to be a seemingly normal vehicle which resembles a standard ambulance, though the exact make and model varies between manifestations. This anomalous ambulance will appear spontaneously in locations where a medical emergency of some kind is about to take place. Just how SCP-4419 is able to predict where and when these events will take place is unknown, nor is it understood how it always takes the form of an ambulance that resembles one appropriate to the local area. Once the medical event has occurred, Whether that be a minor injury like a sprain or something more serious, such as a gunshot wound, SCP-4419 will quickly approach the injured individual. Two individuals which have a humanoid appearance and are dressed in paramedic uniforms that are, just like the ambulance, always appropriate to the location, will exit the ambulance. They will then secure the victim, using a stretcher if need be, and place them in the back of the ambulance. While the individuals who emerge from SCP-4419 will, for the most part, act as though they are normal medical professionals, they will strongly resist any attempt to either impede them in their quest to secure the injured person, as well as prevent anyone else except for their target from getting into the back of the SCP-4419 ambulance, up to and including the use of extreme physical force. As soon as the paramedic-appearing individuals have managed to secure the victim in the back of the ambulance, it will then quickly leave the area at a high rate of speed, and research has shown that as soon as it is out of observation, SCP-4419 will demanifest, along with whoever is inside. But this isn't the end of what this anomaly has in store for its victim. Between 2 and 7 days later, the SCP-4419 ambulance will suddenly reappear at the same area where it picked up its victim. The same individuals will exit the ambulance and leave the victim somewhere nearby before getting back in the vehicle and leaving the scene once again. The victim who is left behind will always have suffered what can only be described as invasive bodily modifications. Their injuries are so extreme that in most cases they should have resulted in the death of the victim, and yet they will always somehow still be alive. While the exact form of modification will vary from victim to victim, there does appear to be some correlation between the original medical emergency and the resulting procedure. And the SCP Foundation has documented a number of encounters with SCP-4419, stretching all the way back to the early 1980s. Some notable examples include one from 1983, in which a pedestrian who was crossing the street was struck by an automobile, resulting in them breaking their leg. SCP-4419 was on site and quickly helped the man into the back of the ambulance. When he was returned several days later, all of his limbs had been reattached in such a way that they were protruding from the front of his torso. In another event which occurred in 1994, a man suffered a broken jaw in a fight outside of a bar. To no surprise, SCP-4419 was on hand and took the man away for treatment. When he was next seen, his jaw had been permanently forced open, and a glass window had been installed in the back of his throat, which permitted direct viewing of his heart, which had also been moved to the back of the throat. Unfortunately, there was no way to reverse this procedure, and the man had to be euthanized. In 2003, a husband and wife were in a car accident where they each sustained multiple broken bones. When SCP-4419 dropped them back off, the two had been fused together at the back, and any bones that were broken in the crash had been removed completely. When an elderly gentleman had a heart attack in 2006, he was picked up by SCP-4419 and returned with 11 new, non-functioning hearts grafted inside of his body. Attempts were made to remove these additional hearts through surgery, but unfortunately, the man did not survive the procedure. In 2008, a structure fire resulted in 19 people suffering extreme burns. 7 more injuries came when a crowd attempted to stop the SCP-4419 paramedics from placing all of the victims in the back of the ambulance, but they were unsuccessful in preventing them from leaving the scene with them. When the group of victims was finally returned, it was as a single organism, a large solitary mass which twitches and shivers when physical contact is applied. No method for euthanizing this organism has been able to be found, and currently they are stored inside of a tank at Site-31. In perhaps the strangest sighting of SCP-4419, a U.S. private was wounded while on patrol in Afghanistan, and a military medical evacuation vehicle arrived to evacuate him. Suspicious about the vehicle's sudden appearance and the forceful conduct of the medical staff, the private's fellow soldiers ended up opening fire on the vehicle. They reported seeing a viscous black fluid leaking from the vehicle's surface, but they were unable to stop it from taking the injured private. In a deviation from its normal behavior, the victim was not returned to the same place, and instead appeared in the barracks the next day. The victim had been broken down into a thin paste and was spread across the walls. Agents were dispatched to secure what was left of the man, and they reported finding a still intact eyeball that dilated when they approached. The collected viscera has been labeled as remains and placed in storage, but it is currently unknown whether or not the victim has truly expired. Due to the danger SCP-4419 presents to anyone who suffers an injury, as well as its ability to appear virtually anywhere on the planet, it has been classified as Keter. Containment efforts at this point are largely focused on maintaining information control and post-manifestation cleanup, as opposed to any attempts at physical confinement.
Anyone who witnesses an SCP-4419 manifestation is to be administered amnestics, and victims are to be treated in order to restore them to their original physical state as much as possible, or euthanized when no viable medical treatments are available, with a cover story constructed in order to explain their death. SCP-4419 is one of the most cruel and sadistic anomalies in the SCP Foundation's database, ranking right up there with SCP-106, the Old Man. Hopefully one day we will find a means to contain this brutal so-called medical vehicle, but until then, be careful if you suffer an injury and an ambulance is suddenly on hand. You might come back changed in ways you never thought possible.
Picture yourself as a small water bug moving across the surface of a pond. The depths of the water below, impossibly vast for your tiny size, and yet you have the ability to ignore all that lies under, because your movement is limited to the surface. That tension is all that keeps your reality from falling apart, though it easily could. All it would take would be for a human to put their hand in the water and make a splash. All of a sudden, the water that you stood on with such stability has revealed its true form, a chaotic and ever-shifting maelstrom that beings far greater than you can alter on a whim. For the water bug, the hand that disturbs the surface of its small reality is so unknowably large and strong that it is worthy of reverence and abject terror, even without any awareness or knowledge of the Titanic organism, the human it is connected to and operated by. While we, as humans ourselves, have the capacity to understand this metaphor, it offers us as little consolation as the fact that the water bug can stand on the pond's surface. We were made to call this unstable reality our home, and to believe that we are solidly present and important within it. But there are undoubtedly beings within reality that exist beyond our wildest comprehension, and some of them possess hands just like ours. A fearful man in a prison suit arrives at a bus stop with little memory of how he got there. All the prisoner knows is that the road he is on is only a few miles from his hometown, a place that he hasn't seen since his unfortunate turn to a life of crime. Vague recollections of being arrested and institutionalized in a correctional facility seem to cloud his mind, but there are some details of the site he was detained at that seem all too fantastical. Though he was understandably quite anxious about the gaps in his consciousness, the prospect of returning home after all this time filled the prisoner with a sense of warm catharsis. He jogged down the road with an almost celebratory glee, reminded of all the times he did so as a youth. The hard cement beneath his feet felt like miles of silk and lace, with how nostalgic it was to be back. The prisoner wondered to himself who would be there waiting for him among his old friends and relatives. He knew his parents wouldn't be there, obviously. But when it came to the townies that he went to school with, there were a few that he knew he had to pay a visit to. The road stretched on in an unusual spiral pattern, but despite that, it was surely the same path that led the prisoner into town. He made it to Main Street in the exact amount of time he thought it would take him, and that was even with the bizarre spiral he ran through on the way there. He thought that perhaps he was only imagining the weirdness of the familiar but unnerving road. Perhaps he was imagining all of it. For a few brief moments, the prisoner's surroundings became a confined and nearly lightless chamber. His first thought was that it was a jail cell, his jail cell. But when he saw what else was inside the containment unit, his mind fumbled for explanations. Within the center of the chamber was a truly enormous human hand. It was not attached to any arm or body of any description, but its errant twitching made it obvious to the prisoner that it was still alive. The prisoner screamed and jumped back into the main street of his hometown, which was where he was, and also where he had been this entire time, obviously. Perhaps a cup of coffee over at Smith's Diner would take the edge off my nerves, he thought. The route back to his nostalgic teenage hangout was exactly as he'd remembered it. That had to be a good sign. Although when he stepped inside the old diner, things were not as the prisoner had expected. There was nobody sitting at any of the tables, which were once packed every day of the week back in the day. The only other person in the diner was the barista behind the counter, whose face seemed inexplicably hazed in shadow. The prisoner was somehow sure that the barista must have been one of his old friends, who had managed to stay out of trouble and become a key holder at Smith's back during their teenage years. He had always thought that his friend would have a future there throughout his adult years, which, while something that a young person might dread, the prospect of a stable job felt much more ideal now that the prisoner had experienced the consequences of a criminal career. He called out to his friend, who seemed unusually focused on operating the coffee machine. This wouldn't be unusual if there were actually customers in the diner, but their absence made this behavior especially strange. The prisoner was talking loud enough for his friend to hear him, but there was no response. Perhaps a solitary person might be reluctant to acknowledge somebody wearing an orange prisoner jumpsuit, even if they knew them at one time. The prisoner would not be deterred and approached his old friend, banging on the coffee machine itself to get his attention. This did manage to get the barista to look his way, but a wave of regret washed over the prisoner when he realized something was very wrong with his friend. The shadows that strangely clung to the barista's face were swirling like black water going down a drain, a sinking void in place of his head. The prisoner thought he was staring into infinity, but deep inside the dark hole that was his friend's face, he could see that same hand from his previous vision, twitching in the darkness. There was something deeply disturbing about this hand, despite, or maybe because of, it seemed unaware of the prisoner's existence. It was likely related to the strange happenings, but there was no way to reason with it. He turned and ran back for the front door of Smith's diner, convinced that whatever he was looking at was no longer his friend, if it ever was. He barreled through the entrance, and to his discomfort, found himself entering into the same room. The interior was identical to how it was just moments ago, but with the one exception of the barista being gone as well. The prisoner was now feeling an uneasy sense of déjà vu. Was this the first time he had entered Smith's diner since he got to town? He couldn't tell, and rather than staying inside and waiting for something more unusual to occur, he left the diner. As soon as he stepped through the door, the memories of seeing his friend, the barista, faded into his subconscious. It couldn't have happened. It was a dream to him. Although at the same time, the prisoner couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been woken up. Given the increasingly disorienting nature of the situation, the prisoner elected to change his approach to exploring this apparently altered version of his hometown. He would go pay a direct visit to the house of one of his teenage acquaintances, hoping to find at least some ordinary people he could talk to. He didn't have a car, so he would have to make the trek on foot. Though being a lifetime criminal meant that the prisoner wasn't above a little Grand Theft Auto, there weren't any cars on the sidewalk to steal. While his hometown was always small in terms of population, it was rarely bustling with activity. The distances between houses because of forestation and agriculture meant that motor vehicles had always been a necessity for the function of the community. To see none of them, and no people either, was not a good omen. The prisoner still remembered the streets well enough, and made his way to his cousin's house while shaking off the feeling of encroaching dread and loneliness. Though he had been mostly a friend of circumstance, the prisoner's cousin was one of his oldest and strongest familial bonds. The two of them had even been local nuisances for the cops together, jaywalking and loitering all over town. As opposed to the prisoner's cousin had grown out of committing crime. However, it was likely that his cousin could still be an understanding presence if he could reach him. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be anyone home at his cousin's house. The prisoner knocked on the front door and back door and checked every window for activity on the inside. The lights were on, but there were no people visible within, let alone the prisoner's cousin. He realized again that his appearance as a jailbird might have been alarming, and that the home's occupants could be hiding from him. Then again, he hadn't seen the police or any police cruisers anywhere. Surely if he was thought to be dangerous, somebody in town would have reported him. Right now, even the attention of law enforcement, however unwelcome it would be in most circumstances, would feel like a calmingly normal event. This caused the prisoner's thoughts to spiral again, as he became paranoid that nobody had been there to witness him since he had come back to town. What if everyone was gone? Frightened, the prisoner picked a broken chunk of cement off the ground and hurled it through the window of his cousin's house. To his surprise, he was struck from behind by that very same chunk of cement. As he looked down at the solid object that he himself had thrown, he heard a sudden noise that sounded like breaking glass. Looking back at the window which he had thrown the rock at, the prisoner saw that the glass had been shattered in a distinctive spiral pattern. The window itself was intact, showing no other signs of damage, but the strange spiral seemed carved almost intentionally. Beyond the now distorted glass, the prisoner could see that the interior of the house had been replaced all at once with an entirely different, but now all too recognizable chamber. It was a dark place with that very same enormous, disembodied hand. Without even knowing he had done it, the chunk of cement was once again in the prisoner's hand. Absent-mindedly, he hurled the cement again into the window, this time breaking its surface into 1,000 shards. The unsettling reflection was gone, and the inside of the house had returned to normal. Or at least, returned to the expected. There was still no sign of the prisoner's cousin, but he had committed to entering the house now. He stepped through the window, unnerved by the lack of an alarm. As the saying goes, it was quiet. Too quiet. He wandered through the familiar house, through darkened hallways and up and down bizarre liminal sets of stairs. It took him a long time to realize that his cousin's house was much larger than he remembered. This was no wonder, as deeper into his delve within the cavernous interior, the prisoner could see that parts of his childhood home had been incorporated into the building. This did not bode well, as his parents' house was the place in town he least wanted to be. But there was no clear way back outside. After ascending a spiral staircase, the prisoner found himself at the door of his parents' bedroom. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, he knew what was waiting for him inside that room. He did not want to open the door. The shadows seemed to grow taller all around him, and as the prisoner turned away from the door, he came face to face with his cousin. Or rather, it was his face looking at a similar void pit to his barista friend, where his cousin's head should have been. Within the umbral darkness of his cousin's whole face, the hand seemed to point towards the door. The prisoner looked on in horror as his cousin also pointed towards the door with one of his own hands. He wanted to close his eyes, to deny what was in front of him, but the image persisted, and the strange disruptions to his senses only became more pronounced. He was hearing things that should not have been happening, partly because they had already happened long ago. The strained voices of his parents gurgling on their own blood seemed to emanate from behind the door. He could hear bludgeoning sounds that repeated at irregular intervals, drowning out and weakening the voices, but not entirely eliminating them. The prisoner could not close his eyes nor plug his ears. Instead, he was transfixed on the twitching hand. Was it testing him? Did it know everything he knew? If I go in there, they'll die. They'll die because I'm the one who took their lives from them. His thoughts were as loud as the cries of pain, but somehow a message from beyond his perception blared through and reminded him of the truth, where he really was.
D34678, get out of there. This is your only lifeline.
It was the voice of the warden of his correctional facility.
No, they weren't wardens. Researchers. And I'm part of their test. They're testing the hand.
As quickly as his fracturing psyche was able to put everything together, the door opened behind him, and out stepped a younger version of himself, carrying a bloody aluminum baseball bat. The prisoner looked this other self in the eye, causing a mutual panic between the two. In fear for his future, the young murderer swung the bat and hit the strange older man in the prison jumper hard in the skull.
There can't be witnesses,
he thought, making sure that his handiwork was fatal. The prisoner did not survive, and apparently neither did his younger self. When the research team from SCP Foundation Site-22 entered the containment chamber, they found that D34678 had beaten his own body into disrepair with a blunt instrument that had never physically existed. D34678's entire phantasmal return to his hometown and his subsequent accidental death being an incident that happened entirely because of the distorted reality of SCP-5688. The giant hand, measuring 3 meters tall and 1 meter wide, is a Euclid-class object that, while animate, does not appear to possess an active psyche. The only movements that SCP-5688 has been known to display are entirely random nerve spasms, which can neither be predicted nor provoked. The hand was discovered beneath Site-22, entirely buried in the dirt and rock of the Earth's crust. It is currently unknown how long the hand had been lying dormant in the place of its discovery, and the only reason that it was unearthed was a planned expansion to the subterranean containment portion of Site-22. The construction project was completed, and SCP-5688 was placed inside one of the newly built containment units. Experiments into the nature of SCP-5688 have revealed that it has an ambient reality warping effect on its surroundings. Usually, this is limited to the chamber where it has been stored, and for that reason, it is meant to remain there so that containment procedures can be upheld. The variance and severity of reality warping that occurs during interaction with SCP-5688 is still being extensively researched through the use of D-Class personnel. While the hand doesn't inflict any direct violence upon the test subjects, there have been a number of casualties among the D-Class due to the completely unpredictable nature of SCP-5688's effects on reality. D-34678's assignment had merely been to observe SCP-5688 uninterrupted for as long as possible, and the unexplained bludgeoning that resulted in his death was only one of the many ways that the altered reality could have manifested. Curiously, another D-Class, D-7452, had been assigned to puncture the flesh of SCP-5688 with a spear in order to see if the hand would defend itself from attack. The results were ultimately inconclusive, as the spear was unable to make contact with SCP-5688. The wood and metal twisting into a spiral shape, along with several of D-7452's fingers. D-7452 felt no pain during the transmutation of his digits, but nonetheless required corrective surgery to detach his hand from the spear. These results raise one of the most unusual pieces of information regarding SCP-5688's reality warping properties, that being the prevalence of spiral patterns. Whether it is the appearance of spiraling shadows or objects becoming bent and reshaped into a spiral formation, it is oddly common for the hand tamperings to repeat this modification. Though there doesn't appear to be a root cause behind the consistent appearance of these spirals, it does suggest that SCP-5688 is not fully chaotic and random in the way that it influences reality. Perhaps the spiral is somehow linked to the Fibonacci sequence, a recursive mathematical sequence that is associated with the golden ratio, an underlying symmetry that is believed to indicate the universal beauty of visual phenomena. Others might say that spirals are a lot more inherently unnerving, as the idea of endless recursion implies an inescapable and hypnotic eternity. The intentions, if any, behind the hand's affinity for spirals cannot be discerned at this time. Though spirals are far from the only trick up the sleeve of SCP-5688's non-existent arm, as it has the ability to trap those who interact with it in impressionist mind prisons that are imperceptible from the outside. Within these delusional sub-realities, almost anything can happen, or at the same time, not happen. The rules of time and space are suspended, and this can result in a number of alterations that cannot be replicated or conceived of outside of describing the results of the test. In a test involving one D-Class, the subject both died in a gratuitous explosive fashion, and yet also lived through the experiment, albeit trapped in an inaccessible state of suspended sleep. Both results were recorded by the Foundation, and both are effectively true, with the research team present at Site-22 recalling both events with perfect clarity. SCP-5688 has the uncanny ability to allow contradictory outcomes to occur within the same moment and span of time. Measuring and cataloging the numerous effects of SCP-5688's reality distortion are certainly the primary source of research into the Euclid-class object, but there is a secondary purpose to the tests that are being conducted. Dr. Henrik, a veteran researcher of Site-22, has been adamant about acquiring a functional DNA sample from SCP-5688. Though attempts to extract such a sample have proved to be a Herculean task, the importance of this endeavor is paramount to Dr. Henrik. Ever since a brush with SCP-5688's tendency to create pocket realities, Dr. Henrik has been reasonably convinced that the hand is somehow a replication or alternate universe variant of his own hand. This theory does not have much in the way of proof outside of Dr. Henrik's testimony on his own experience with the hand, as well as the experiment log that was updated without the knowledge of any member of the research team. An inference could be made about the location of SCP-5688's discovery, and that its proximity to Site-22 could imply a connection between Dr. Henrik and the hand. This wouldn't be the first time that an SCP was believed to have been brought into existence as a result of a researcher being exposed to warped reality, especially if the theory that connects SCP-106, the Old Man, and Dr. Robert Scranton is to be believed. SCP-5688 might be another SCP that was created as an incidental result of the Foundation's research. Alternatively, SCP-5688 may be the fate that awaits Dr. Henrik after an event that has yet to occur in our reality. The third party responsible, whether it is a conscious force or not, would be the unknown catalyst of SCP-5688's existence. Maybe the event that turned the hapless Dr. Henrik's hand into SCP-5688 will never actually occur in our reality, but did fully and irrevocably occur in its own version of reality. While this might be good news for Dr. Henrik, as he won't need to fear for the safety of his limbs, it also means SCP-5688 exists and will continue to exist, regardless of anything the Foundation can do. Ever worried that someday you might just up and disappear? There's nothing quite like a Sunday afternoon picnic in the park. The fresh air, the lazy hours sprawled out across a blanket, sharing company, food, drinks, and the beauty of the outdoors. The young man and his girlfriend spent their afternoon doing just that, enjoying a bit of slow living on a Sunday. Now, the sunset has streaked the sky with red and orange, and the air is beginning to cool to a less pleasant chill. It's time to pack up the remnants of the picnic and head on home. He carries the blanket, and she carries the basket, each of them keeping one hand free so they can still hold hands. They begin the walk back to the young man's apartment through the steadily emptying park. It's a familiar walk, one they've taken every Sunday for the past year that they've been together, and they take it at the same slow, easy pace as the picnic. There's no rush, not today. That's what Monday mornings are for. Right now, there's just the sunset, the park, and her hand in his. The young man catches a glimpse of a squirrel burying a nut in the dirt under a nearby tree. He goes to squeeze his girlfriend's hand to point out the adorable sight, but she pulls her hand out of his. She's changed course, walking toward a pair of benches, transfixed on something there. She asks in a strangely panicked voice whether he saw it. Strange, he can't spot anything out of the ordinary. The girlfriend insists with unnerving intensity that she saw some kind of strange light for a split second. Something that was gone as soon as it appeared, but left an indelible impression. The young man laughs uneasily. Something's wrong. Can't quite explain what it is. The hairs on the back of his neck are standing up. He tries to change the subject back to the squirrel. He turns to point out the squirrel again, but she remains fixated on whatever she can see that he can't. He can feel a knot forming in his stomach, a sense of dread, as his body screams at him to get out of there as fast as he can. He tries to soothe his overactive nervous system, to remind himself that there's no danger here. But just before he turns back to his girlfriend to suggest they hurry home, he hears a soft thud as something lands in the grass. He turns to see the picnic basket lying on the ground, dropped there all of a sudden. His girlfriend is nowhere to be found. He calls out to her, but there's no answer. It's as if she vanished into thin air. Terrified, the young man combs the park for any trace of her, but aside from the picnic basket, there's nothing. He calls the police and files a missing persons report, but there's little they can do. There are no signs of any foul play, no reason to believe anything has happened to her. She was simply there one moment and gone the next. The young man doesn't sleep a wink that night. He calls out of work the next day, determined to continue his search. If the police can't help him, he'll just have to get to the bottom of things on his own. He calls his girlfriend's parents, but they haven't heard from her since Saturday. Her friends haven't seen her or received so much as a text. She didn't go into work either. Desperate for answers, he returns to the park, pacing back and forth in the spot where she vanished by the benches. As he does, he hears a sudden sound that makes his heart leap into his throat. Her voice, just a whisper, as if her lips are mere inches from his ear. She calls his name. She asks him what happened. He doesn't know what to say. He whirls around, searching for her face, but she isn't there. Is it just his imagination? His grief causing him to hallucinate the voice he wants to hear the most? There it is again, her whispering to him, telling him that she loves him, that she misses him, that she can't feel her body anymore. The young man's knees buckle, and he collapses onto the grass, weeping. It's as if she's right there, but just out of reach. He can hear her, but he can't see her, can't touch her. He asks her what on earth happened. I don't know. I don't know where I am. I don't know what I am. I don't. Her voice grows weaker, fading to static. She's fading away, and he can't do anything to hold on to her. His eyes settle on the tree where he saw the squirrel the day before. The bark swirls in a pattern that, when he stares at it too long and lets his eyes unfocus, looks almost like her face. He reaches out, brushing his fingers against the bark. It isn't her. Of course it isn't her. He doesn't hear the voice again. Maybe it was never really there at all. But he can't shake the feeling that she's still there, somehow, somewhere. Like she's just out of sight, on some other plane of existence he can't see. Sitting there, in the grass where she disappeared, he can feel her so clearly in his mind. He has a sudden, vivid memory of their first date. She spilled her coffee all over him, and they had to go back to her place so she could lend him a clean pair of pants. She was terrified he would be angry, but they laughed about it for the rest of the day instead. He can smell that coffee, feel that laughter bubbling in his throat. It's more vivid than a simple memory. It's her, somehow. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spots something strange. A fluorescent, glowing light, radiating blue and yellow, twisting and turning in his peripheral vision. He turns toward it and climbs to his feet. He reaches out toward the shape, unable to stop himself, and then he's gone. The police would never discover what happened to the couple. How could they? They were victims of a force that the authorities could never hope to understand. This young man and his girlfriend encountered an anomaly known as SCP-001. SCP-001 is a semi-corporeal ontokinetic tetrahedral construct. Try to say that 5 times fast. The physicality of the anomaly is of dubious and spurious nature. As a facet of its containment, the anomaly is semanto-conceptually bound to the statement contained within Unit 7783 of Site 196. SCP-001 cannot always be perceived, and its perceptibility varies depending on the nature of the person attempting to perceive it. When effectively perceived, the anomaly emits a fluorescent glow on the blue-yellow gradient and maintains a fixed position in space no matter what kinetic force is used against it. SCP-001 is extremely difficult to physically interact with, and can only be done using a complex series of actions known as semanto-conceptual interactivity. This is also the method through which SCP-001 was contained. There are unfortunate consequences to effectively interacting with SCP-001 on a physical level. Doing so causes abstraction, biological, conceptual, and ontokinetic in affected subjects. This tends to result in said subject transforming into an intangible conceptual sapience. I'll elaborate a bit more on that side effect in a moment. Individuals subject to the influence of SCP-001 who are affiliated with the Foundation are referred to as Personnel-Associated Sapient Concepts, or PASCs. These sapient concepts still retain their higher cognitive functions, though they lack the biological functions associated with their original physical human forms. They are still capable of interacting with reality via cognitive subversive impression, or the limited and brief interference in the psychological and neurological activity of sentient and sapient beings in their vicinity. PASC presence can be detected through this brief interference, as well as an increase in parietal-like tendencies in those nearby. For those unfamiliar with the term, parietal-like tendencies refer to the tendency to see patterns and meaning in random stimuli. For example, seeing a face in a piece of burnt toast, observing a surprised facial expression in the shape of a faucet, or eyes in a wallpaper pattern. SCP-001 was first discovered by senior researchers Dr. River Cories and Caden Powell while the two were off-duty. Some of the details of this initial discovery have been redacted from the official file due to potential concerns of containment breach, but the general shape of events is easy enough to determine. The two were taking a walk in the park together when they stumbled upon the anomaly. Dr. Corys took matters into his own hands by accident, performing a semanto-conceptual interaction with SCP-7783 without realizing what he was doing. 2 additional personnel were brought in, and the anomaly was successfully bound and contained. However, in the process, Dr. Corey's exposure proved to be too much, and he began the process of PASE transition. Caden Powell specifically requested that all interviews conducted between him and Dr. River Corys during the latter's transformation to be redacted from the official file on SCP-7783. Without those, we only have the general report to go on, but it does still provide an important glimpse into the transformation process. An hour after exposure to SCP-7783's effects, River displayed intact conceptual coherency and acute emotional distress. He seemed to be aware of what was happening to him, as well as his helplessness to stop it. His relationship to his physical form was still intact at this point, but he could feel just how temporary that state now was. After 1 day, River's conceptual coherency had gone from intact to intermittent. His physical form was still intact most of the time, but it was growing more and more difficult for him to communicate linguistically with Dr. Powell. 1 week later, River's conceptual coherency was described as spurious. There was an increase in cognitive subversive influence, and his biological functions were beginning to shut down as the physical body began to become less and less tangible. After 1 month, River's biological and physical form became entirely abstract. Dr. Powell observed an increase in parietal-like influence, seeing the lost man's face in everything he looked at, even when it could not possibly be there. The leaves on a nearby tree, the bark on its trunk, the ripples in a puddle of water, it all looked just a bit like him. But then Powell would blink and the image would be lost. What would later be regarded as standard PASE influence began to manifest in the area, as exhibited by the parietal-like effects, as well as a general psychic impression. It was most prevalent in the immediate vicinity of the disassociated fruiting body. 1 year after River first stumbled upon SCP-7783, he was entirely converted into an abstract entity. His physical form was lost, and subversive cognitive influences were observable. Even outside of PASE proximity, parietal-like influence persisted for associated individuals. The most affected was Dr. Powell, who continued to see River's face everywhere he looked. It became so prevalent for him that he sought a psych evaluation, but it was confirmed that he was not suffering from any mental illness or grief-induced hallucinations. This increase in pattern seeking by the brain and recognition of facial imagery and random visual stimuli was due to River's lingering PASE influence. After Dr. River Corys was lost to SCP-7783, Caden Powell took on the role of Provisional Containment Director. His number 1 priority was to determine methods that might allow for the reversal of SCP-7783's effects. As far as I can tell, no such methods have been uncovered yet. But Powell is persistent and has dedicated every ounce of his brainpower and every resource afforded by the SCP Foundation to uncovering a way to restore those lost to SCP-7783. During my research into SCP-7783, I was able to access an interview between Research Director Caden Powell and D-Class number 78990, conducted as part of a larger study on PASE cognitive subversive impressions. The purpose of this test was to induce an impression in order to open up a line of communication with PASE-01, formerly Dr. River Corys. If PASE-01 could influence the mind of an individual, perhaps that individual could act as a conduit of sorts, through which Powell and River could speak directly. Research Director Powell began the conversation with a polite greeting and the confirmation of D-78990's date of birth and full legal name. D-78990 confirmed his identity and asked what exactly they were doing during this experiment. Powell responded, "Well, essentially, I'm here to just talk to you for a bit, take some notes on your behavior and the like an evaluation of sorts." D-78990 shifted awkwardly in his seat and asked what they should talk about. Powell shrugged. The response shocked D-78990. "Aren't you leading the way?" Powell shrugged again, idly clicking his pen. His brow furrowed, his thoughts seeming to be far away. "I guess we could start with something like, say, a favorite color." "Favorite colors?" The D-Class couldn't help but laugh at that. "Favorite colors? I thought it'd be something more, I don't know, science-y?" Powell sighed. "Well, I'm mostly just monitoring your behavior, looking for any signs indicative of..." D78990 sat up a bit more stiffly in his chair, anxiety spiking. Signs of what? I got cancer or something? No, Powell shook his head. Just... never mind. Why bring up cancer out of all things? Now it was D78990's turn to shrug. I don't know. My dad died of it, a long time ago. What type? Lung cancer, stage 4. The conversation felt less like a typical Foundation research interview and more like the makings of an awkward first date. The back and forth, the get-to-know-you dance of questions and half-hearted answers. Powell offered a verbal olive branch, an attempt to sympathize. I knew someone whose dad passed from lung cancer. Yeah, well, we probably saw it coming. He was a pack-a-day smoker for... Powell interrupted. 22 years. D78990's eyes widened in surprise. Oh, nice guess. Yeah, 22. You know, I would have loved to work here, D78990 remarked. Really? Powell raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? From what I've seen, you don't have a research background. I wanted to go into medicine when I was younger, you know. Powell nodded. Would have been nice to work for a place like this, one with a real purpose, you know. Powell smiled weakly. Yeah, it definitely beats working in IT for a bunch of geriatrics. D78990 laughed at the remark, and Powell furrowed his brow, confused. River would have laughed at that joke. At the unexpected mention of his lost partner, Powell flinched. Yeah? D78990 nodded. He would have, yeah. Always hated working back in Loxy. Powell's eyes lit up with nostalgic recognition. Yeah, I remember. I remember it too clearly. D78990 laughed along with him, despite never having worked with Powell and Dr. Corey's in the past. Oh, definitely, it was crazy times, crazy times. Used to get so mad at that place. Get run up for the stupidest stuff, you and... Man, me and him. We really did. Chris always had a stick up his butt, though. Made it hell. He was too old to be working, that's why. Always decomposed at the desk. What was that one joke you made about his nose to me? D78990 was now speaking about Dr. Corey's memories in the first person. Which one? Powell asked. The night after D&B? Oh, the one about him looking 8 and 80 at the same time? D78990 cackled, throwing his head back. Please. Oh, God. River was crying laughing to that. That night was the most he had laughed in a long time then. Powell cracked a smile. Yeah, I remember that night. It was amazing, just making stupid jokes to each other, enjoying the time we had. Like all the time in the world was ours, huh? Made everything better. Life was perfect. Powell sighed. The neighbors didn't hear perfect, D78990 remarked. But the neighbors always complained about how loud we were. Powell shook his head. Well, I was loud. Noisy. That was something you liked about him. D78990 switched back and forth between third and first person, sometimes speaking about River, and other times speaking as if River was talking through him. I still remember his laughing. I still remember it all. D78990 smiled wistfully. You just didn't know how to take it seriously. Powell laughed at that, a smile breaking free from his mask of composure. Ha! Well, yeah, that's how he was. Always loud and bursting with energy. Made every situation colorful. Wonder if this River guy's still like that, D78990 remarked. Oh, he's still out there somewhere. Powell wiped the tear from his eye. Still the life of someone's party. Who is? Powell's stomach dropped. That was it then. The impression was gone. He sighed, composing himself. He wouldn't show his grief to this stranger. He forced a terse, polite smile. Never mind. And that was the conclusion of the interview. D78990 and Dr. Powell had never spoken prior to the interview, nor had D78990 ever previously met Dr. River Corys. Still, with some anomalous intervention, the two had been able to share a few memories of the man, and for a moment, he was still as he was, tangible, human, alive. But the moment was fleeting, as are all impressions of those changed by SCP-7783. As for containment procedures, the specific instructions for the semento-conceptual, or related to the inherent semantic information of a concept in reality, binding of SCP-7783, may only be accessed by a select few specialists. Any personnel assigned to the area are strictly prohibited from any hypothetical, speculative, fantastical, or intimate thought related to SCP-7783. I am only able to engage with the subject matter to this degree from a safe distance, and do not suggest you approach the area after learning this much about the anomaly. Due to its particular nature, amnestics are not sufficient to treat its impact on the human mind. Complete amnesticization of personnel regarding its existence, or lack of existence, would cause cemento-conceptual unbinding. This would technically result in a containment breach. Such is the trouble with semi-corporeal constructs. Essentially, as long as it is known to be contained, the containment should hold. If you have a bit of a headache trying to wrap your mind around the whole situation, you are not alone. Though amnestics are not an acceptable solution to SCP-7783 and its influence, selective thought-blocking medications derived from Class C amnestics can be used to induce a sort of deliberate brain fog, a barrier that prevents an individual from thinking about SCP-7783 in any way that extends beyond particular containment-related tasks and day-to-day Foundation operations. Once upon a time, in the earliest days of my research, I may have said that I didn't believe in ghosts. As a man of science, I balked at the concept of that which I could not prove with empirical data. But now I have seen, encountered, and learned of too many inexplicable forces in this world to hold the same view. Perhaps the victims, and I do believe them to be victims, of SCP-7783 are not ghosts in the traditional sense. They did not die, after all. Their bodies simply dissolved. Their consciousness remained in some form. But is that not what we think of when we think of a ghost? The lingering impression of someone who was once flesh and blood? Take away the body, and what remains, whether you call it a spirit or a personnel-associated sapient concept, seems to meet the criteria. Dr. River Corey's is gone. At least, the part of him that could be seen, perceived, known, and loved. What remains is that brief impression, that glimpse of a memory, ever so brief. That laugh, once shared, never to be heard again. There may not be any rattling chains or creaks on the staircase, but SCP-7783 has created its fair share of what I feel compelled to call ghosts. Agree or disagree with my verbiage, I don't mind. Those left behind are still just as haunted. They call him the Grill Master. At least, he says they do, never clarifying who calls him that. But he's got the custom-printed apron to prove it, worn over his flannel shirt. It features orange flames over a black material, a skull with two spatulas crossed underneath it, and his assumed title emblazoned at the top. He's the Grill Master, and nobody can take that away from him. His barbecues are legendary, famous throughout the state, or at least known about by the other fathers living on the street, either because they've been to one before or witnessed the huge column of smoke billowing upwards from behind the house and blotting out the sunlight. Flames roar from the barbecue, beers are being chugged, kids are running around screaming, all under the scorching heat of the Florida sun. The Grill Master stands proudly at his station, smiling to himself in the knowledge that this could well be his most famous cookout of all. He's never hosted one this attended before. It's sure to make the neighbors forget about the divorce. One of the kids rushes over to him, wielding a blue and green water gun. Trouble. The Grill Master warns them not to spray near the fire, but the kid just giggles in response. It's all a game to them. They have no idea the reputation on the line. The Grill Master issues another warning, but the unruly child protests, whining that they just got this water gun at a yard sale and they haven't been able to shoot anyone yet. With a sigh, the Grill Master closes the lid of the barbecue, protecting the precious meat from the stream of water he's expecting to be fired any moment now. Sure enough, it streaks through the air and splashes him, seeping through his custom apron. The child is placated, and the Grill Master goes to wipe the water with his hand, only to feel an intense burn against his skin. He recoils, staring at his hand in horror as the skin begins to melt before his eyes. He tries desperately to pat himself dry, only for the searing pain to reach his chest as whatever the corrosive liquid is melts its way through the fabric and starts eating away at his flesh. Little does the Grill Master know, as he falls to the ground writhing in pain, something tiny is being carried through his bloodstream, wriggling its way into its new home. Him. A suburban summer barbecue that ended in chaos sounds like perfect folly for the SCP Foundation. It didn't take long for the Foundation's operatives to swarm the small Florida town, managing to stay undetected thanks to the wide-scale administering of amnestics on the local populace. None of the neighbors, nor any other local residents, ever remembered what had happened. The creature they'd seen and the unfortunate victim that had become its host were scrubbed from everyone's memories. Local hospital and employment records for the man were expunged, and what was left of an injured civilian was taken into Foundation custody, along with anything else from the scene of the incident that could serve as evidence. Foundation scientists immediately got to work examining the man, who was suffering badly from chemical burns. However, the researchers' focus was on trying to determine the exact point of origin of something that had manifested inside his body when he'd been sprayed. Some scattered suggestions arose about making an attempt to separate the two, to try and save the civilian's life from whatever had bonded itself to him. An assessment revealed that the man the creature was now seemingly using as a host was still alive, but rapidly losing brain and motor function. As a result, saving his life was deemed by the finance department to be an inadequate allocation of Foundation time and resources. Researchers at the Foundation were told to ignore the man's pleas for help and instead focus solely on the creature. It didn't take them long to determine the obvious, that whatever this organism was, it was unlike anything found on Earth. From closer testing and examination, it seemed that what had bonded with the human host was some kind of unidentifiable unicellular organism, which the Foundation scientists took to nicknaming Kelvin. They were able to take a closer look at Kelvin, discovering that the single-celled life form was largely comprised of an organometallic polymer and enamine chains. As well as being radically distinct from any life form native to Earth, Foundation researchers were baffled by how exactly this tiny organism had embedded itself in a human body, or more concerningly, why. Based on its structure and chemical composition, the unicellular creature didn't seem at all suited to survive in the conditions within a human being's body. The Foundation's top scientific minds were able to run a number of simulations to determine the perfect environment for housing an organism such as Kelvin would be a liquid solution of dissolved methanol, formaldehyde, and acetic acid, along with various salts. Of course, these chemicals all naturally occur within the human body. Methanol, also known as wood alcohol, is in fact present in a number of organisms, including animals and plants, as well as human beings. Fresh fruit and vegetables, some fermented beverages, and even diet sodas that contain aspartame are all good sources of methanol. Formaldehyde and acetic acid are both derived from methanol as well, and are commonly created via chemical reactions in order to be used as the base materials in products like acrylic plastics and synthetic fabrics, making all three of these chemicals present in clothing, adhesives, and paint, as well as within a human body. As part of the metabolic process, humans naturally produce around 1.5 ounces of formaldehyde, as well as acetic acid, which actually helps to metabolize certain fats and carbohydrates. However, while all the necessary chemicals and salts for Kelvin's survival were present in the body it was now living in, that didn't mean that the single-celled creature was necessarily suited to being inside a living host. For one, a human body is itself a more complex organism than a unicellular life form like Kelvin. As a result, the body's natural defense systems made it a dangerously hostile habitat for unexpected visitors. Human antibodies typically don't take kindly to intruders and will often attack foreign cellular bodies in order to protect vital organs and keep them functional. The same way that a human body protects itself from viruses was also defending the unwilling host against Kelvin. Although Kelvin was draining its host's metabolic system of methanol, formaldehyde, and acetic acid to survive, thus weakening the immune system, it wasn't enough to prevent antibodies from attacking the unicellular life form. The longer the man was kept alive, the more antibodies he was producing, and these were eroding holes in the cell wall that protected Kelvin. So once again, the Foundation scientists faced another dilemma. Did they keep the host alive and help his body reject Kelvin? Or did they experiment with strengthening the single-celled organism in order to see what happened? The decision was deferred from the research team up the chain of command. The finance department made the same case that the Foundation's resources were better spent on understanding this single-celled anomaly, but the ethics committee was quick to argue that the Foundation's job was to protect the public from anomalies. By letting Kelvin's human host die, they'd be abandoning their primary mandate. Eventually, the decision reached the O5 Council, who were alarmingly quick to sidestep the ethics committee's concerns and approve the research team to keep Kelvin alive and functional, no matter what it did to the host. So, following the orders of the council, researchers focused all their efforts on Kelvin. they were able to introduce and synthesize a solution containing all the necessary chemicals that the unicellular creature needed to survive, a cocktail of methanol, acetic acid, salts, and formaldehyde, which they then introduced to the host's bloodstream. Sure enough, this abundance of the chemicals it needed for nutrition only strengthened Kelvin, so much so that within days it was able to resist antibody attacks. The cell wall surrounding it was impenetrable, and the near-microscopic organism's mass started to rapidly increase, the more essential metabolic chemicals that it absorbed, both from the scientists feeding it and what little its host had left. Within weeks, Kelvin's host resembled a withered, desiccated zombie more closely than a living human being. Intravenous bags of synthetic metabolic chemicals were hooked up to his body, with Foundation personnel instructed to disregard his weak pleas for someone to help him. A few raised concerns whenever his heart rate lowered to the point he had almost flatlined, but this only ever resulted in an electrical jolt that jump-started his regular heartbeat. All the while, Kelvin was being fed. Scientists had been observing the unicellular life form through specialized microscopes, meaning they hadn't noticed the change right away. Focusing in on the same spot soon became akin to staring at a singular drop in an ocean. Taking X-rays of the host suddenly showed a dark mass spreading out within their chest cavity. It was clear that Kelvin had undergone something of a growth spurt. Where it had started as a single cell, since the Foundation had started nurturing it, Kelvin had begun producing its own mass within the human host. Before long, it was substantially bigger, so much so that it was observable without the equipment needed before. However, some of the scientists weren't exactly put at ease when they noticed alien twitches coming from beneath the host's skin. It quickly became apparent, even to those who hadn't seen the X-ray images, that Kelvin had changed in shape as well as size. The creature seemed to have fit itself within its host's chest cavity, but the more rapidly it grew, the more it posed a risk of becoming too big to stay inside the unfortunate human. 3 appendages, thought to be arms or legs, were curled up right over where the man's stomach should have been displacing his organs. The rest of Kelvin's newly grown form seemed to vaguely resemble a sunfish, one of the largest vertebrate fish in the world. Further scans revealed that Kelvin's increased size meant the creature was also developing its own set of internal organs and bones, almost like an embryo, rather than the single cell it had started out as. The Foundation might not have known exactly what kind of creature Kelvin was, or indeed where it had even come from in the first place, had it not been for an emergency incident that took place in one of their facilities. It just so happened that the same site where researchers were keeping Kelvin alive inside its host became the target of an attack by none other than the Chaos Insurgency, the dangerous splinter group that formerly served as part of the Foundation. The attack had been swift and brutal, with Chaos Insurgency operatives storming the facility with ruthless efficiency. Thanks to their training from disavowed members of the Foundation's elite mobile task force Alpha 1, the Red Right Hand, these insurgents were able to navigate the halls of the research site in an attempt to raid it for anomalous items that they could use in their ongoing war against the SCP Foundation. Since they were established by the O5 Council, the Chaos Insurgency had a long and storied history of operating under the cover story that they were traitors to the Foundation, stealing anomalies in secret to further the Council's own shadowy agenda. However, they had long since defected and now served their own nefarious agenda, launching strikes against Foundation facilities, seizing SCPs with dangerous potential, and eliminating Foundation personnel. The aftermath of the Insurgency's attack was a mess. The bodies of Foundation researchers and personnel had been left strewn throughout the hallways of the research facility. Cleanup crews were given the unpleasant task of removing the remains and wiping down the bloodstains, while research staff from other sites were called in to take over the various projects and anomalies being studied by their less fortunate colleagues. That was when they found Kelvin. In one of the facility's labs, a Chaos Insurgency operative was discovered dead, pinned beneath the body of something inhuman. What little was left of Kelvin's human host had been splattered in multiple directions. The scattered fragments of a ribcage found by cleanup crews suggested that the creature had burst out of the body it had been inhabiting, either because it felt threatened somehow, or its host had sustained damage during the Chaos Insurgency's raid. Sure enough, security footage was recovered from a backup of the site's closed-circuit surveillance system that corroborated the working theories about what had happened to Kelvin. In the footage, a platoon of Chaos Insurgency gunmen stormed through the facility, exchanging fire with security personnel as they systematically cleared every room on every floor, one by one. Squads split off to examine anomalies, looking for any that would suit the insurgency's goals, while the rest of their forces continued the raid. At one point, though, a lone insurgent split away from the main group and wandered into a research lab. Stepping inside, they were met with the sight of Kelvin's human host, almost entirely emaciated, barely alive. Either out of cruelty or a willingness to put the man out of his misery, the insurgency operative produced a sidearm and terminated the host. Upon their death, the body began to convulse violently, the movement emanating not from any kind of post-mortem muscular spasms, but from something moving around inside the host's body. The Chaos Insurgency operative reacted by opening fire with their weapon again, before the host's chest ruptured and Kelvin, now fully formed, spilled out. Able to move uneasily on its three legs, the creature launched itself at the insurgent, either in an attempt to attack in confusion or retaliation, possibly even trying to pass from its previous host to a new one. Traces of cyanide were discovered in the Chaos Insurgency operative's mouth, suggesting that they had a contingency against Foundation capture in place. It was suspected that the surprise from seeing a creature like Kelvin erupting out of a cadaver made the insurgent accidentally bite down on a cyanide pill disguised as a tooth. At this point in the footage, the Kelvin creature seemed to stop moving, losing consciousness. By the time it was discovered after the raid, it had already perished. Foundation researchers brought in to take over the examination project were at a loss. All of the work done to nurture Kelvin and grow it inside a human body had seemingly now been for naught, thanks to the Chaos Insurgency. Uncertain of how to proceed, it wasn't until another security recording surfaced that the researchers were given their best lead as to how to continue the project, and it came from the most unlikely of sources, a Foundation security officer. During the Chaos Insurgency's assault, the officer had been captured by surveillance cameras fleeing for his life. Having run out of ammunition and frantically searching for an additional magazine or another weapon to defend himself with. However, thanks to the Chaos Insurgency's knowledge of the Foundation and their expectation that mobile task forces would be deployed to counter their attack, their operatives had first seized control of the site's armory. The only option that left the fleeing security agent with was to scour the areas of the facility the insurgency was yet to reach, which drove him towards an evidence room. Frantically emptying boxes, looking for something even remotely resembling a viable self-defense option. In his search, the security cameras showed the Foundation officer discovering a piece of evidence recovered from the Florida barbecue where the Foundation had discovered Kelvin. It was an unassuming water gun, made out of blue and green plastic with an orange nozzle and trigger. When interviewed following the raid, the security officer clarified that his intention had been to surprise a Chaos Insurgency operative, temporarily blinding them with a spray of water directly to the eyes, then disarm them, relieving them of their firearm to use it to defend himself. This wasn't what happened. Little did the officer realize that he had just retrieved the missing piece of the puzzle when it came to the question of the unicellular lifeform's point of origin. The water gun wasn't a simple child's toy. It was SCP-3788. Upon discovering the anomalous water gun against a member of the Chaos Insurgency, the security officer unexpectedly doused the target with a pressurized jet of liquid ammonia. On contact, the corrosive substance dissolved the insurgents' bodily tissues, rapidly and agonizingly melting them. Their injuries were fatal. Following the discovery of this incident, the Foundation's researchers requisitioned the anomalous water gun. It had been incorrectly stored as evidence following the Florida incident, with the previous research team too fixated on the development of Kelvin to notice what had appeared to be a harmless child's toy. Researchers began investigating the object's capabilities in an attempt to determine a link between the ammonia-firing water gun and the now-deceased specimen of a single-celled organism. Testing didn't take long to yield the answers they were searching for. The screw cap for filling up the gun with water was sealed shut and impossible to open. Threading a fiber optic camera through the gun's nozzle only showed what looked like the empty interior where water would normally be. Yet, as Foundation personnel soon discovered, SCP-3788 itself was where Kelvin had come from. The gun itself contained a spatial anomaly, linking it to an unknown location. When fired, the high-pressure jet of corrosive liquid ammonia that was released was from wherever this spatial anomaly led to. Upon further examination of the dangerous chemical released whenever SCP-3788's trigger was pulled, Foundation experts discovered the presence of other chemicals, namely dissolved methanol, formaldehyde, acetic acid, and various salts, exactly what Kelvin had needed in order to survive. Also contained in the ammonia solution were several unidentified unicellular organisms, each consisting mainly of organometallic polymers and enamine chains, and unlike any other life form found anywhere on Earth. In short, they were more of Kelvin. Through continued usage of SCP-3788, Foundation researchers were able to use the anomalous water gun to eject multiple additional samples of these single-celled organisms. Capturing these, they were able to cultivate them in much the same way Kelvin had been allowed to grow, but without the need for human hosts, instead preserving them in ammonia tanks and feeding them the same synthetic solution that had allowed Kelvin to grow from its unicellular form. On occasion, use of SCP-3788 would result in the ejection of an unidentified organism that resembled a sunfish, each possessing 6 eyes and 3 limbs. On further inspection, these creatures also shared a similar biochemistry to the single-celled organisms and to the deceased remains of the Kelvin test subject. Testing using SCP-3788 was suspended, however, following an incident now designated Incident 3788-G. 4 months into their experimentation with the anomalous water gun, the object unexpectedly ejected a 35-meter-long metallic vehicle, which was propelled out at the same velocity as the liquid ammonia. This caused it to crash through several rooms of the Foundation facility, resulting in numerous workplace injuries and a handful of deaths that have since cost the Foundation dearly in compensation. The vehicle itself seemed to resemble a submarine. When Foundation agents opened up the metal hatch to its entrance, a group of 8 organisms emerged. Each displayed signs of sapience, as well as sported 3 legs and appeared to resemble sunfish, much like Kelvin had. However, all 8 of the creatures quickly lost consciousness, suffering from atmospheric shock, and were immediately rushed to ammonia tanks to keep them alive. An inspection of their vehicle by the Foundation uncovered pictograms, as well as a written language that has only been partially translated. Based on this information, the Foundation has cause to believe that the creatures originated on Titan, one of the moons of Saturn, and that this is where the spatial anomaly within SCP-3788 leads to. A conclusion that almost nobody suspected, but was undeniably and literally out of this world. A perfect shot. The photographer holds up his camera, focusing on the deer. Then, the creature turns and stares down the photographer with the face of a human man. A long, elegant neck ending in a mutated abomination. The photographer drops the camera and runs away screaming. He won't be coming back to get it. He'd rather just buy a new one. A woman is walking her dog along the dirt road she's walked down every day for several years. It winds alongside a dense forest and past several large plots of land. Some are occupied by farms, some have been left abandoned. It's a pleasant walk, one she can always count on to be as quiet and peaceful as it is stimulating for her dog, with plenty to look at and smell. Occasionally he gets distracted by a wild animal, but the odd squirrel or possum is nothing the dog hasn't seen before, and she can quickly get him back on the path with a whistle and a tug of his leash. As the two of them near a familiar bend toward the halfway point of the walk, she can't help but notice that something seems off about the dog's behavior today. His steps are anxious, and his hackles are up. He keeps sniffing the air, tugging at the leash, whining insistently, as if trying to tell her something. She soothes the dog, promising him that there's nothing over there. The area he keeps staring at, a low growl rumbling in his chest, is an abandoned farm. No one's been over there for years, but no matter what she does, he keeps staring at that abandoned farm in the distance. Suddenly, there's a rustling sound, some sort of unseen animal moving through the bushes toward the farm. The noise sets the dog off, and he jolts in its direction, yanking so hard and so abruptly on the leash that it flies out of his owner's hand. Free to pursue whatever had been aggravating him so much, the dog tears off toward the abandoned farm. The woman chases after him, desperate to catch her beloved pet before he gets himself attacked by a wild animal, or worse. She sprints after the dog for half a mile until they've passed the ruins of an old barn and reached a horse paddock that seems to be in surprisingly good condition. As the woman catches her breath, she spots a sign she'd never noticed before on the road. It reads, "The Miracle Farm." The paint is unchipped, vivid, even fresh. This doesn't look abandoned. Her dog barks sharply, and she follows the sound. There he is, crouched low to the ground, shaking and barking at a pair of horses. Wait. No, those aren't horses. They have the hooves, the haunches, the tails, but their upper bodies are all human torso, arms, head, and face. It shouldn't be possible, but her dog is barking at what appears to be a pair of centaurs. She grabs hold of his leash, urging him back from the strange beasts. As she backs away, she hears a sound behind her, like a person imitating the crow of a rooster. She spins around and sees a wide-eyed man with a bright red wattle on his face, feathers jutting out of his neck. He crows again, then stoops to peck at the ground. Just behind the rooster man, she sees even more impossible human-animal hybrids. Rotund, pink-fleshed children with pig noses roll in a puddle of mud. A woman coiled up on a rock stares straight ahead, forked tongue flitting in and out of her mouth as she hisses. This place isn't abandoned after all. There is still a farm here, but it's no ordinary farm. The woman scoops her dog, her completely ordinary non-human dog, into her arms and sprints back toward the dirt road. She keeps going, running all the way home until she can get to a phone, and immediately calls the authorities. The first few people she speaks to laugh at her, accusing her of making a prank call, but one man takes her seriously and records her report. Then he passes it on to his friends at the SCP Foundation. They conduct a raid of the Miracle Farm and find that it is just as bizarre as the woman described. They uncover files in their office detailing that the property once belonged to Marshall, Carter, and Dark Limited, before its ownership passed to a private company that specializes in the finest in custom-ordered pets, prey, and companions. Mobile Task Force Theta 2, Moreau's morgue, is deployed to the scene, where they bring all on-hand personnel, clients, and living specimens into custody. Personnel and clients are questioned, then given Class A amnestics and released. The specimens are contained for further study, and the facility is destroyed. But not before the MTF discovers a curious marble statue, acting as a fountainhead, providing all drinking water for the animal-human hybrids on site. The statue, depicting the Roman goddess Venus, allows water to flow out of its mouth when pumped in through the base. Somehow, water flowing through it is causing ordinary animals to transform into these bizarre creations. But how? Before we tell you, first, I have a question directly for you. Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Regardless if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human who lives in this world who's going through a hard time, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, and this is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/DrBob. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with the therapist and see if it helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing with therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost, without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/DrBob. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. And now back to the strange marble statue. The fountain is quickly removed from the area and brought to the Foundation for further study. And that is the story of how the SCP Foundation got its hands on SCP-1575. As is frequently the case at the SCP Foundation, the research team quickly began conducting controlled experiments using SCP-1575. They exposed a variety of animal test subjects to water that had passed through the fountainhead. I combed through the test logs I was able to access and have compiled some of the most relevant examples of the anomaly's effects on various subjects. I must warn you that some of the imagery contained within may be a bit disturbing, even by SCP Foundation standards. I admit that a few of them turned my significantly desensitized stomach, but still, they fascinate me, and like a train wreck in slow motion, I haven't been able to look away. Test 1575-2 was was performed on a female Japanese field mouse, Apodemus argenteus, at the adolescent stage of development. After several weeks of exposure to SCP-1575-1, the mouse began to rapidly increase in size. Over the course of 12 days, the mouse grew to a height of 1.01 meters, a 500% increase in overall body size. As the mouse began to grow, her fur falling out and being replaced with smooth, human skin, her face warping into that of a young human woman, her appetite increased drastically. She was provided a standard field mouse diet of fruits, berries, and nuts, and consumed nearly 95% of her body weight at a given time in this provided food. By the 12th day of her mutation, the mouse's heart was unable to support her rapidly growing body, and it gave out. She died due to failure of her cardiovascular system, leaving behind an eerie half-mouse, half-human creature with a vestigial tail, partially transformed paws, and gray-tinged skin where her fur had once been. Test 1575-4's subject was a pre-adolescent male white-tailed deer, Otocoileus virginianus. The deer began to mutate fairly quickly following exposure to the water, and its initial steps were an alarming sight, to say the least. He began to suffer severe hemorrhaging in the pelvic area as his reproductive organs atrophied. By the end of the mutation cycle, they had disappeared entirely, leaving a smooth, fleshy surface behind. Several male researchers in attendance had to leave the room during the initial bleeding, and one asked to be referred to an on-site counselor regarding a persistent, recurring nightmare inspired by the mutation. The deer's arms and legs changed into human arms and legs, hooves into hands and feet. By the end of the process, which stabilized after 30 days, the deer had become an androgynous-looking Eastern Seaboard Native American person. The only remaining indicators that this had once been something other than human were a tail and antler nubs resembling those characteristic of yearling bucks. After testing the anomaly on prey animals, the researchers decided to explore its effects on a predator. The subject of Test 1575-6 was an adult female Bengal tiger, Panthera tigris tigris. Naturally, there were concerns about the safety of researchers given the subject's aggressive nature. To prevent any accidental injury or death, she was kept sedated for the duration of any hands-on examination. Unfortunately, the application of these sedatives had a negative impact on the tiger's health during the mutation process. After 4 days, before any dramatic visible transformation had even taken place, the tiger experienced failure of the heart, liver, and kidneys. Though this experiment was largely regarded as a failure, it provided the team with a vital piece of information. Sedatives should not be used on test subjects until they were further along in their transformation and at least 80% stabilized. After the tiger, the research team pivoted to the least threatening version of a similar animal, an adolescent female domestic cat, Felis catus. The transformation occurred without incident over the course of 30 days. It was described as unsettling to watch, especially coupled with the pained yowls of the subject, which slowly transformed into the screams of a young woman. But the subject survived the process. Her body stretched and contorted, claws turned to long, pointed fingernails, whiskers fell out, and fur was completely shed. By the time her transformation was complete, there was a young woman in the containment chamber, crawling around on all fours and batting at particles of dust. She retained her tail, the aforementioned pointed nails, and eyes with the same vertical slit pupils she had as a feline. She spoke several times, but only to request additional food. After testing on a cat, the next natural step was to test the anomaly on a dog. For Test 1575-9, the subject was an adult female domestic canine, Canis lupus familiaris, of mixed breed. At this point in time, it was believed that the fountainhead had no anomalous effect on invertebrates. Unfortunately, this experiment proved otherwise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The dog was exposed to the anomalous water, and dramatic signs of mutation soon began to show. First, the dog began shedding all of its fur. At this point, the researchers got an unfortunate look at something that had been hiding in the dog's coat, an infestation of fleas, which were beginning to transform as well. The fleas had quadrupled in size and were continuing to grow. Even more horrifying, their legs had changed into appendages resembling human fingers, and their features rearranged into a nightmarish facsimile of a human face, blood pouring from their open mouths. Unfortunately for the test subject and any researchers present, the fleas were not the only parasite that had infested this dog. On the 6th day of the experiment, the slowly mutating dog collapsed on her side, breathing heavily, exhibiting intense discomfort. Her abdomen began to distend, and nearby researchers could see something wriggling just beneath the skin. The motion became more violent, and the abdomen distended further and further, as if the dog was progressing through the stages of pregnancy at an advanced rate. One of the researchers made an anxious comment about being reminded of a particular scene from the movie Alien and was admonished for it. But he was quickly proven right, because with a sudden burst, a tapeworm with the face of a man erupted through the skin, screaming at the top of its lungs, eyes rolling wildly in its sockets. One researcher vomited, another fainted. The experiment was swiftly aborted, and testing procedures were updated to include a specification that all subjects must be examined for parasites prior to any exposure to SCP-1575. None of the mutated creatures survived this test. The dog test was a colossal failure on many counts, but it inspired the research team to continue testing on non-mammals, not invertebrates, no one wanted to go down that road again, but other animals at least. For test 1575-12, the subject was a pre-adolescent female hyacinth macaw, Anodorhynchus hyacinthinus. The parrot swiftly began to change, and the sound of agonized caws filled the room, along with a sickening snapping sound. After a moment, the sound was identified as breaking bones. The rest of the bird's body, particularly the muscles and organs, were transforming at a faster pace than the skeleton. The body contorted painfully, and the wings began to split, forming into rudimentary fingers and hands. But the transformation never finished, never stabilized. After 20 days, the macaw was dead, and the cause of death was determined to be internal injuries due to these extensive bone fractures. The subject of test 1575-13 was an adult female leopard gecko, Eublepharus macularius. The transformation occurred at an accelerated rate, and within 1 week, the lizard had grown to a height of approximately 4 feet and displayed many human characteristics, including human legs and feet, a face, and a full head of hair. The hands remained unchanged, though they were larger, and the specimen was still capable of climbing up walls, much like an ordinary gecko. At the 10-day mark, the subject experienced catastrophic organ failure as a result of the mutation and expired. One more test on an invertebrate was conducted, this time deliberately. For test 1575-14, the subject was a female common green grasshopper, Homocestus viridulus. As the mutation began, the grasshopper began to shed its exoskeleton in a process best described as flesh forcing its way out of a casing, breaking the exoskeleton into pieces. What was left following this shedding process was a creature resembling the same grasshopper, but 3 times larger and covered in human skin. It continued to grow, but no further human features seemed to develop. After 15 days, it expired. An autopsy revealed the development of human organs inside, including a heart, lungs, kidneys, and liver. The cause of death could not be determined, but the transformation process is thought to have made the subject incompatible with life. The subject of test 1575-15 was an adult female grizzly bear, Ursus arctos horribilis. During the first 29 days of her mutation, the bear did not consume any food or drink aside from SCP-1575-1. Still, she did not appear to experience any hunger or discomfort aside from the pain of the transformation itself. Her body slowly shrank over the course of 30 days, her fur thinning until it left only the ordinary amount of body hair for an average human woman. Notably, the hair was the same color as the fur she had once had. She retained her bear paws, which appeared to be uncomfortably heavy at the ends of her new human arms. Throughout the transformation, stool samples taken from the subject showed excessive amounts of organic matter, such as blood and fatty deposits. After 32 days, the mutation was complete, and the former bear's condition was stable. She did not speak. Instead, she used her newly transformed mouth and voice to grunt and roar. It was much less intimidating coming out of her human mouth, but researchers noted that her paws and claws were still dangerous and should be avoided. The subject of test 1575-16 was an adolescent female Gravy's zebra, also imperial zebra, Equus grevii. Over the course of 27 days, the zebra's main body, hind legs, and most of her head mutated into a human, resembling the appearance of a person native to Africa. However, her front legs and jaw structure remained that of a zebra. The transformation stabilized, leaving her in this half-changed state. She was unable to move without pain, unable to eat, and exhibited extreme distress at her state of existence. When she attempted to walk, she would lose her balance and topple over, lying on the ground in agony. It is uncertain what caused the transformation to halt at such an incomplete stage, but the subject's quality of life had been all but destroyed. After a thorough physical examination, the half-transformed zebra specimen was euthanized as a humane measure. As disturbing as the results of the Foundation's tests using SCP-1575 were, they allowed for a more thorough understanding of the anomaly and how it operates. The statue, which was studied extensively, shows no anomalous properties on its own, nor do any samples taken of the marble throw up any red flags. It appeared to be a completely ordinary statue, except for the effect that it has on any water that flows through it. This water, or SCP-1575-1, begins to show its anomalous true colors when consumed by a non-human mammal. Non-human mammals who consume 0.5 or more liters of this water per day will begin to mutate over the course of a month. Perplexingly, impossibly, they will mutate into a human being. During the experiments, it was noted that the ethnicity of the resulting human seems to correspond with the humans native to the natural habitat of the pre-transformation mammal. A European deer displays Caucasian features, for example, while a North American deer resembles a Native American. Domestic dogs and cats have ethnically ambiguous features or appear mixed race, likely due to the mixed backgrounds of their species. Many of the survivors of this process develop vocal cords and are able to speak about their experiences, but their odds of surviving are not great. Female specimens have about a 25% fatality rate. Males have a staggering fatality rate of about 95%. There is a 40% chance that the transformed animal, regardless of sex, will keep at least one premutation feature. These include, but are not limited to, paws, tails, ears, and fur. Across the board, those who survive the mutation process describe it as extremely painful. Though these transformed animals can communicate, they tend to display an intelligence level that aligns with their prior species. There are a few exceptions to this, as some subjects have displayed heightened problem-solving skills, but it is uncertain what exactly caused this shift. Proposed causes include neural restructuring during mutation or an unintended byproduct of the Foundation testing itself. These transformed instances do not magically become human in behavior, personality, or habits. They retain their animal instincts, memories, and sense of self, give or take some added depression or anxiety brought on by the traumatic and drastic changes they've endured. Humans exposed to this anomalous water do not seem to change at all, which makes a degree of sense. If the water serves to transform mammals into human beings, then a human drinking it has nothing for the water to change. Still, I wouldn't suggest drinking it. Tap water may not taste great, but it's far less likely to mutate you. SCP-1575 is currently held in a 6 meter by 6 meter by 4 meter containment chamber at Biosite 23, with direct access to Research Laboratory 3 at the same site. Unless it is actively in use for an approved test, no water may be allowed into SCP-1575's containment. After testing has concluded, all water used during the test is to be held in quarantine and may only be used for further tests. At the time of my reading, I discovered one addendum added to the file for SCP-1575 by a doctor assigned to the anomaly. It reads, "Following the incident on the 12th of this month, during test 1575-9, any animal to be used in testing with SCP-1575 is to be thoroughly examined for both external and internal parasites. Our initial beliefs that SCP-1575-1 only affected the primary host has proven wrong. It apparently retains its mutagenic properties, even when ingested secondarily through the host's lower GI tract or bloodstream. We absolutely do not need another instance of half-mutated flea creatures, and the psychologist is having a hard time helping Janet with her nightmares of a 7-foot-long tapeworm with a screaming face tearing out of the belly of a dog. I fear that Janet and I may have those nightmares in common. This imagery will stay with me for quite some time. When it comes to drinking water from mysterious fountains, proceed with caution, my friends. Sure, this particular fountainhead may not trigger mutation in humans, but that doesn't mean it's the only one of its kind out there. Drink from the wrong water spout, and you may find yourself changed, and no one, including me, can predict what you might become."
A man is lying in a hospital bed, and it is clear that he is not doing well. A group of doctors buzz around him performing various tests, checking his vital signs again and again. The man feels weak and a little disoriented, and the looks on the various doctors' faces tells him all he needs to know. Something is very wrong with him. Finally, there is a break in the commotion, and the doctors stop prodding at him and peering into his eyes with a bright, blinding light. All of the doctors and nurses leave the room except for one. The doctor steps towards the man and tells him that he has some bad news. You see, before the doctor can finish, someone else emerges from the shadows in the corner of the room and taps him on the shoulder. I'll handle this. The man hadn't noticed this person, but he can see now that he's dressed in a suit, and unlike the doctors, he doesn't have any identifying items like a name tag or badge. Maybe he's some kind of professor, or a renowned surgeon who is going to tell him how they will make him better. The doctor steps back from the bed, but the man in the suit tells the doctor that it would be best if he and the patient could be left alone. Just for a moment, of course. The doctor nods in agreement and leaves the room. The man in the suit waits until the door is closed behind him to continue. He tells the sick man that he has a rare condition, quite rare. So rare, in fact, that you're the only person to ever have it, the only recorded case in history. The man in the suit sits down on the bed next to the man and takes his hand, lifting it up, examining it. The man's hand is an odd color. It has a slight green tint to it, and the skin itself appears to be taking on a fibrous quality. The sick man feels very tired, but he manages to whisper, "Are you a doctor? Are you going to help me?" The man in the suit responds, "Yes, I'm a doctor. Of sorts. A doctor and a researcher. I work for a very important organization, and I specialize in cases just like yours. Well, not exactly like yours. You're unique. Quite special, in fact." The sick man offers a weak smile. "I'm very lucky." "Oh yes, very lucky indeed. Well, not because of your condition, of course, but because I am here. You see, if it's all right with you, we'd like for you to come with us, to come stay at one of our facilities for a while. We can't promise that we'll be able to figure out exactly what's happening or why. But if we can, we have a much better chance of figuring out how to cure it. To cure you, so you can go back to a normal life." "Do I have much of a choice?" the sick man asks. "Of course you do. It's completely up to you. I think this would be your best course of action, your best by far, in fact. But we can't force you to do anything you don't want to do." The sick man looks down at his greenish hand again, turning it over in front of his face, examining the small growths that seem to be sprouting from his skin. "When do we leave?" "Right now," the man in the suit tells him. "The nurses will come get you ready, and then we'll be on our way." The man in the suit leaves the room and closes the door behind him. Standing next to the door in the hallway are a pair of men wearing tactical uniforms like a SWAT team. The man in the suit tells them that luckily they won't be needed today. This one is coming easy. The sick man lies on a bed, but now he is in a new room. This one is even more sterile than the hospital, with cold concrete walls and harsh fluorescent lights. Just like in the hospital, he's surrounded by a seemingly never-ending cast of doctors, nurses, and researchers. They too poke and prod at him, take samples, and administer all kinds of tests. As time goes on, the man's condition only grows worse. It seems there's nothing that they can do to stop his condition from advancing. The green color spreads across his body, and his skin soon becomes woody and stiff. If he sits in one place for too long without moving, tiny fibers emerge from his skin, like probing roots looking for soil. All the while, the man grows weaker and more fragile. Even the slightest movement seems to cause him great pain. The doctor who originally brought the man to the facility gathers with a small group in the observation room next to the man's containment cell. They discuss the results of a recent test, which showed that much of the melanin in his skin has somehow been replaced with chlorophyll, and that the fibrous quality of his skin is being caused by the appearance of cellulose around his cells. In other words, he isn't just starting to look like a plant. He's truly becoming a plant, and there doesn't seem to be anything they can do to stop it. Try as they might, they haven't found a single clue as to what is causing the man's condition, or how to treat it. The man, though, seems strangely at peace with his fate. He's told that they're going to allow him to live, whether that be as a man or as a plant in containment, for as long as he can stay alive, and that he will be well taken care of to make the whole process as comfortable for him as possible. Even though they failed to find a cure for his anomalous disease, they will do everything in their power to make sure he doesn't suffer. A tragic yet familiar tale for the SCP Foundation. A normal person is subjected to an abnormal situation that completely changes their life, and not for the better. At least in this situation, the Foundation appears to have shown a rare glimpse of their own humanity.
opting to make this safe class anomaly's existence as painless as possible, rather than force it to endure a lifetime of painful tests and studies. Or at least that's what you've been led to believe. Unfortunately, everything you've just seen about SCP-1500 is a lie. Those with Level 3 clearance, though, can learn the truth, which is that SCP-1500 is actually an extremely dangerous anomaly, whose true identity must be hidden from even the majority of the Foundation, for reasons you'll soon learn. SCP-1500 is not a man suffering from a condition that causes him to slowly transform into a plant-like being, but is actually a greenish-gray, smooth-skinned humanoid with no facial features at all. Its limbs are long and multi-jointed, and its abdomen is highly distended. The skin is exceptionally durable and tough, and though SCP-1500 has no visible sense organs like ears or a nose, it still appears to possess senses that are roughly equivalent to an average human's. The entity is incapable of speech, owing to its lack of a mouth, and it has not shown a need to eat, breathe, or sleep at all. In addition to the strange appearance of SCP-1500, its primary anomalous effect is the impact it has on any human that comes within its line of sight, or rather what would be its line of sight if it had any eyes. Those that do find that they will soon begin experiencing headaches, nausea, and an overwhelming sense of dread. These symptoms will increase over the next several minutes, with the headaches becoming more and more debilitating, and the feelings of nausea and fear growing until eventually the subject passes out. They will remain unconscious for roughly 15 seconds, after which they will awaken and claim to have no memory of ever being exposed to SCP-1500. But something else strange also happens to the subject after waking. When asked to describe the creature known as SCP-1500, they will no longer remark on its faceless head or long twisted limbs. Instead, they will describe the creature as being an average-looking Caucasian male. Even stranger is that to them, it now has a name: Zachary Callahan. In further interviews with subjects exposed to SCP-1500, it became clear that many of their memories had been reshaped to now include the entity in its human-looking Zachary Callahan form. They would often describe him as a close friend from childhood or early adulthood, and one that played a significant role in their lives. They also claim that they are perfectly capable of communicating with Zachary Callahan, able to carry on conversations with him, while all the observing researchers will see is an apparently one-sided conversation between the subject and the featureless gray-skinned creature. While Foundation personnel have found that they are able to remove the false memories from the subject's minds through the use of amnestics, they have yet to be able to reverse the effect that causes the subject to see SCP-1500 as a human being, and everyone who has been exposed continues to see the entity as Zachary Callahan forevermore. It is still unknown what kind of long-term effects this exposure may have, or how dangerous to their mental or physical health it will turn out to be. Even more concerning is that evidence has emerged that SCP-1500 may be able to affect more than just those in its immediate presence. Recently, a United States senator was giving a televised speech on a rather uninteresting topic. The speech started out normal enough, but then the senator began to relay an anecdote about a childhood fishing trip he had taken with a friend. You won't be surprised to learn that according to the senator, the friend's name was none other than Zachary Callahan. Investigations into the senator's background concluded that there was no person by that name of the appropriate age in the area where he grew up. It was also discovered the senator had suffered an especially bad migraine at a dinner party the week before the speech. Further research into SCP-1500's memory-altering effects have also revealed that they might just be more intrusive than first believed. Rather than simply appearing as an old friend, subjects exposed to 1500 have begun to report that Zachary Callahan actually played a much more prominent role in their lives, either as a close relative, a parental figure, or even a former lover. In each of these cases, the subjects described their feelings for Zachary Callahan as ones of adoration, and that he made them feel protected and loved. Most troubling of all is a recent addendum to the SCP-1500 file, which describes the very latest research on the anomaly and its effects. It is now estimated that as many as 23,000 people all across the world have been affected by the creature, with the idea of Zachary Callahan implanted into their memories. It is unknown why it is trying to spread its influence so far and wide, but one clue that may point to a nefarious purpose is that it seems to be disproportionately targeting political and military figures, as well as SCP Foundation personnel. Following these new developments, classification of SCP-1500 to Keter was requested and granted. Due to the risk that SCP-1500 poses through its anomalous effects, and its powerful ability to influence those in positions of great power, It is permanently kept in a modified humanoid containment cell at Site-17. No personnel are allowed to enter into its containment chamber under any circumstances, nor are there security cameras in its cell. A false containment document describing a human male with an anomalous plant-like effect was placed in the database in order to deter further investigation into the real SCP-1500. And any personnel who experience painful, persistent headaches are immediately transferred away from Site-17, while any who attempt to breach containment are immediately terminated. Is SCP-1500 planting the seeds for something big by infiltrating the minds of some of the most influential people on Earth? Or is it merely looking for a connection, as it takes on a form that it wishes it could have, in the only way it can, inside an imagination? Perhaps one day, we will know the answer.
What is it that you want? Not just what you want in this moment. That's fleeting. You get it and move on. Or you don't, and you forget. No. What do you want? What do you yearn for? That humming dissatisfaction that underscores every moment of your life. The constant rumbling, always beneath the surface, that you can never put your finger on. Behind your computer monitor, at the bottom of your $4 coffee. That quiet moment when you go to the toilet at a friend's wedding and look at yourself in the mirror, asking, why am I not happy yet? This moment, this object, this feeling that I was looking forward to. Why does it feel empty? A night in with your best friends, a promotion at work, a new car, a new house, all empty. So when I ask you again, I want you to be serious. None of that fake surface-level fleeting drivel. What is it that you want? What will genuinely make you happy?
The words buzz around the student's head. He hasn't listened to a word of this lecture, not for a moment. Last night's therapy session had clearly struck a bit too close to home. He'd never expected this new therapist to be so direct. What was it that he really wanted? The student looks down at his laptop. He'd really wanted that. He'd spent months researching it, holding off on buying other models, waiting and saving up for the perfect computer. And here it is, with the same old boring lecture notes on the screen as his old one. Within a week, he'd been back online looking up new phones. Here he is, 21 years old already, and studying for a degree he doesn't really care about. Surrounded by happy, smiling students who are all clearly going to be far more successful and happy than he'll ever be. Beautiful people everywhere he looks. People who know how to dress well, know how to have a conversation, how to smile and laugh with friends, how to have friends in the first place. His therapist is right. What's he got to be happy about? That dissatisfied humming running through his life is steadily turning into a roar. What would actually make him happy? The more he thinks about it, the more the sense of dread creeps in. What has he actually got to look forward to in life? What can fill that void? The lecture is over. He hadn't even realized. Everyone around him is already on their feet, putting notepads and laptops into bags, chatting away with their friends. The student doesn't have anyone else in his row. He's somehow picked the only row in the lecture hall with just one person in it. No, that's not the case. This is the only row in the lecture with just one person in it, because he picked it. His only company on this row? A fly. A fly that had been following him around all week. What's the point? He looks at his laptop screen. Empty. His phone buzzes. It's his mom. He declines the call. Swinging his bag onto his shoulder, the student makes his way to the door. A group of guys up ahead are chatting loudly as they open it. One of them half glances back over his shoulder. He stops in the doorway, holding the door open. The student looks around. No one else was with him. Who's this guy holding the door open for? You okay? The guy asks, looking straight at the student. His eyes are very blue. The student rushes through the doorway, muttering a "thank you" on his way through. His phone starts to ring again in his pocket. He sits up alone that night. He does the same most nights. Even if he wanted to, he wouldn't be able to fall asleep. Sharing a house with 7 other people, there's a party happening in one part of the house pretty much every night. The thumping bass is the only sound to reach the student as he sits quietly at his window, looking out at the bags of trash lining the street and the couple across from him arguing on their porch. The little fly in his room is the only one keeping him company. not buzzing around or trying to escape through the glass, just sitting there next to him, watching the world go by.
What is it that you really want?
The words ring around in his head again.
Tell me what will make you truly happy. What is it?
I think I just want someone to love me, the student says quietly. He sits quietly by the window for a few more minutes, not noticing as the little fly next to him catches fire and rolls onto its back, legs curled in the air. The student just goes to bed. Nothing's ever going to change, is it? A week later, the student is back in that same lecture again. He arrived early this week, sitting down and unpacking his stuff a good 15 minutes before they were due to start. Surreptitiously as he can, the student glances over at the door every time he hears it swing open. It's the usual procession of beautiful, happy people, each one dressed exactly how they want. Personalities, goals, and aspirations filling each of them. He looks down at his outfit. Gray. The lecture starts, but the student still can't quite focus. He keeps his head half turned towards the door the whole time, waiting. 10 minutes go by. Nothing. He slumps down in his chair and starts taking notes, just as the door softly creeps open behind him, making a gentle hushing noise on the carpet. The student turns. There he is, the guy from before with the blue eyes. The student tries his best to swallow his grin. He's the only one in his row. If he can just get the guy's attention, maybe he'll come and sit with him. But no, that's a stupid plan. Why would anyone want to come and... The bag lands in the seat next to him. The student turns to see those same piercing blue eyes. "Anyone sitting here?" the guy whispers. The student opens his mouth to reply, but the words get stuck. After a second, he manages to shake his head. The guy with the blue eyes grins and sinks into the seat. After a moment, he asks if he can borrow a pen. That's funny. The student can see a pen right there in the side pocket of the guy's bag. Why would this guy choose to sit with him? There are plenty of free seats in this lecture hall. They're everywhere. One thing's for sure. The student definitely can't talk to this guy afterwards. No way. He's too weird, it'll be obvious. No one ever wants to have a conversation with him. Everyone he talks to is always sidling their way out of the room after just a couple of minutes. Besides, what if this guy finds out what he's really like? That he's been seeing a therapist. Not just a therapist. That would be pretty normal. Normal people do that. No, what if this guy found out that his therapist was a fly? A fly that had been following him around, that he'd been talking to every night before bed. A fly that had been asking him what his deepest desires were. A fly that he'd woken up to find dead and burnt on his windowsill this morning. Nope, no way is he going to have a conversation with this guy. It would just be a disaster. There's no other option. He has to call his mom. As soon as the lecture is over, he'll call her and deal with whatever it is she has to say. He takes the phone out of his pocket and stealthily gets his mom's contact details up, ready to hit the call button as soon as the lecture finishes. There, the final slide. The student hits dial and immediately turns away from the blue-eyed guy next to him, getting up and putting it to his ear. He shoulders his bag and marches out of the lecture hall, not looking back until he reaches the little square of grass outside where he sits. His heart doesn't stop hammering until he's sitting there. His mom takes a long time to pick up. When she does, it's clear that she's been crying. Not this again. The student swallows and prepares for her to start ranting. Only she doesn't. Instead, she just asks where he is and if she can drive over and get a coffee with him. He says yes, hangs up, and looks down at the phone, brow furrowed. What's she got to say to him this time? A shadow falls over him. Turning, the student just sees two blue eyes. The guy is holding out the borrowed pen, a gentle smile on his face. His mom doesn't come for coffee in the end. Instead, she invites herself over to his house. It's the first time she's visited. As they make their way up all the flights of stairs to his floor, the student holds his breath, waiting for her to start complaining about the cigarette butts, ashtrays, and pizza boxes lining the hallways. But she doesn't. She doesn't say a word. He closes the door to his room behind her, and she lets out a sympathetic little sigh looking around. He probably should have tidied first. Here it comes. He can feel it. She's about to start lecturing him on his dirty clothes, leftover dishes, his unmade bed. But no, she just quietly picks up a sweater and starts folding it. Then another. As she tidies his room, she shoots him a sad little smile. This house really won't do. He explains to her that it's all he can afford at the moment. Well, then let me help you so you can find somewhere better. What's going on here? He doesn't know how to react. This is surely one of her games. Any second she's going to lash out at him. But no, she just gently brushes the dead fly off the windowsill into the trash and turns to him. They stand across the room from each other, the same way they always have, 8 feet between them, plenty of space, not too close. She closes the distance and pulls him in for a tight hug. As his mom buries her head in his chest, he notices for the first time how short she really is. Has she always been that height? Didn't she used to tower over him? Her muffled voice speaks into his chest, right into where his heart is beating. I'm so sorry for how I responded before. I didn't know what to say. You're my son, and I'm proud of you. I always have been. You love who you love. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Even your silly old mother. For a long time, the two of them stand there, crying together. It is a busy week moving everything into his new apartment. It's still a pretty basic place, but at least it's his own. The neighbors are quiet, the street is clean, and there are no flies. By the time the student sits down for his lecture, he's completely exhausted. He barely registers the bag landing on the floor next to him and the guy sitting in the seat. He's so tired, in fact, that the conversation catches him off guard. He hadn't prepared anything to say. But suddenly, they're talking. About the weather at first. It's sunnier now. Then about the class. Then why they chose to study here. Then their teenage years. Then their homes and families. The lecture starts, but the two of them keep muttering away to each other in hushed tones. The student cracks a joke, and the guy with blue eyes laughs. Properly laughs. He isn't just being polite, he actually found it funny. So funny that the lecturer tells the pair of them off, which just makes them laugh more. Is this what it's like? To be one of the beautiful, happy people? Days go by, and the student wakes up every morning expecting it to be over. He's going to wake up any minute now, and he'll be back in his old house with a talking fly waiting for him by the window. But he doesn't. It's sunny, day after day, week after week, no flies in sight. He calls his mom. He doesn't just pick up the phone to her, he actually starts to call her. He goes to parties, discovers he likes white wine, and finds out what it's like to have a bit too much of it. He has his first kiss and opens his eyes to see a pair of perfect blue ones staring back at him. He makes friends, more friends than he can count. Friends who text him asking to hang out, who help him move house, then move house again, and who fill up rows and rows of seats the day he gets married to the man he loves. The man who loves him back. Is this what it feels like? Is this happiness? Maybe, just maybe, this is it. Until one day, the man wakes up. Everything's perfect. The sun is still shining. He can hear his daughter's squeals from downstairs. His world is still happy. Except for one thing. His ear hurts. Not that much, but there's a little something. A kind of dull itch deep in his ear canal. The other ear starts to hurt as he makes his morning coffee. He should probably go to the doctor about it. He'll book that this week. But by that night, he knows he probably shouldn't wait any longer. He lies awake deep into the night, feeling his lungs tightening. You're not supposed to feel your lungs, are you? But it's not just his lungs. It's his throat, too, and his bowels. All of a sudden, his stomach starts convulsing. He throws off the sheets and rushes into the bathroom, not quite making it to the toilet. His vomit splatters across the tiles. He must be getting delirious. That can't be right. It looks like his vomit is moving, wriggling, and crawling. His husband appears behind him, switching on the light. The two of them stare in horror at the writhing maggots covering the bathroom floor. The X-rays and MRIs paint a grueling picture. Each progressive scan over the next couple of days looks worse than the last. What had once been healthy flesh and organ tissue steadily has deeper rivets chaotically eaten into it. The maggots work their way through the man's throat, lungs, stomach, sinuses, ears, bowels, and urethra. In some places, they run out of flesh and end up burrowing their way out of the surface of his skin. By the time the maggots mature into flies, the man is on his deathbed. Excessive blood loss, organ failure, and multiple infections have worn his body down to a husk. There's nothing left to be done for him. All that the man's husband, children, mother, and countless friends can do is stand by and watch, as one by one, thousands of flies emerge from the body of the man they'd once loved so dearly. Heartbreaking as it may be, this is the sad reality of what you sign up for when you make a deal with SCP-3063, known informally as the Fly. This SCP on the surface seems like one of the most harmless that the Foundation has encountered, taking the appearance of a common housefly. It has no extraordinary physical properties, nothing apparent to distinguish it from any other fly, and yet, it is one of the most powerful entities with an apparent ability to somehow alter reality itself. It is believed that SCP-3063 only exists in one instance at a time, though this is very difficult to prove given the sheer number of flies that exist around the world. As soon as one instance of SCP-3063 dies, a new one seems to manifest in a random location. Naturally, this makes studying the fly very difficult indeed. As far as the Foundation is aware, the fly communicates with its human target telepathically. It interrogates them, trying to discover what they want most in the world. It will then offer the individual that exact thing. If they refuse, it will make increasingly grand offers, tempting them with greater and greater promises until they accept. When I said this was one of the most powerful known SCPs, I was not exaggerating, because this fly does not make empty promises. Do you want to become a millionaire? You might wake up tomorrow to a number of anonymous bank transfers or a handful of lottery tickets pushed through your letterbox. Do you want to become an opera singer? The next time you sing in the shower, you'll find a whole new voice coming from your chest. Who knows, you may have left the window open and a superstar agent could be strolling by your house at that exact moment. Whatever it is that you tell the fly that you want, it will be granted. The little insect will catch fire and die straight away, appearing somewhere else in the world, ready to start talking to someone else. Your answered wish may not always take the form you expect, but it will be given to you, just like our student finding love everywhere he went for the next 6 years. Or, to be more precise, 2,376 days. You see, as soon as you make a deal with this fly, the clock is ticking. For 2,376 days, you will be free to enjoy your dream coming true, no strings attached. Until one day, you wake up with a little bit of discomfort, like something growing inside of you. Eggs, anything from 5,000 to 20,000 in number, will suddenly appear throughout your body. In your digestive system, respiratory system, and even your muscle fibers, small maggots will be born comprising all known Diptera species. They will steadily eat away at your body, feeding their way out of you and growing into regular adult flies as they emerge. Most individuals die from multiple organ failures during this stage. It can often be difficult to identify the exact cause of death, as the attack on the body's central systems is so absolute, devastating, and swift. If the individual dies before the 2,376th day, then the process is halted and the flies die along with them. Attempts to contain SCP-3063 have all proven unsuccessful. To date, 6 members of SCP Foundation personnel have been targeted by the fly. Each of them have tried to make a different wish to contain the fly, but each has had a loophole exposed. Senior researcher Elizabeth Gao requested the death of SCP-3063, which the fly interpreted as the death of that manifestation, combusted, and returned in another instance. Senior researcher David Roberts asked for the permanent containment of SCP-3063. The fly then stood totally still, allowing itself to be taken into secure containment below Site-63. But sure enough, after 2,376 days, the researcher died, and the fly was discovered to still be manifesting around the world. It again had interpreted its containment to refer to just that current instance of its body. A later researcher requests knowledge of how SCP-3063 functions, at which point the fly combusted and a document containing all known information about SCP-3063, everything I am telling you now, appeared before the researcher, who later died. The penultimate test conducted by SCP personnel proved to be the most chilling. Dr. Patrick McGann asked the fly if it could provide clear, understandable knowledge of SCP-3063 other than knowledge currently possessed by the SCP Foundation. The results of that exact experiment and the next one were provided for him, including details of his own death, which he immediately fulfilled. Either the fly has some precognizant abilities or is able to directly control events in the world, or both. The final experiment was conducted even though the fly had already provided the results in detail ahead of time. Dr. Jonathan Mabry simply asked, "Is there even a choice?" before suffering a severe pulmonary embolism and dying on the way to the hospital. Research indicates that SCP-3063 has been operating for over 4,000 years, with evidence of instances being discovered as far back as early Canaanite settlements. However, many theorize that the fly has been with us a lot longer than that. Unless future containment efforts are more successful, SCP-3063 will likely remain one of the most powerful and prolific entities outside of containment. So next time you see a fly buzzing around your room, it might be in your best interest to leave it alone.
If you want to support this important mission while also getting influence over the anomalies we cover and an exclusive look behind the scenes, check out the DrBob Patreon and become a junior researcher today.
Now go and watch another entry from the classified files of Dr. Bob, such as SCP-632, Intrusive Arachnid Thoughts, if, for some reason, the idea of seeing more creepy crawlies manifesting in human bodies appeals to you. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single anomaly as we delve further and further into the SCP Foundation's classified archives.